The Innkeeper by Life Sketcher. Chapter 521 Immortal Bastion. Creating a third settlement was an exciting task for Lex, but first he had to decide where to build it. The Midnight Manor was right in the center of the inn, Main Street was right below it to the south, and the village, where most of the entertainment was based, was to the west. To the north was the greenhouse, which was ever expanding, so Lex wanted to avoid building in that direction. That left only the east without anything major, so that is where he decided to build. The design of the third settlement was very different from anything Lex had built before, for he did not want to pack all the guests densely in a concentrated area. Instead, it would be a vast, sprawling development spread over a large area. Instead of tall buildings and structures, there would be a multitude of buildings 1 or 2 stories high dotting the entire region. As was customary, every time he added something prominent to the inn, he expanded the size of the inn. It was not too much, just about 20,000 acres of land added in the east for a total of 200 million MP. It was not an exaggeration to say 20,000 acres was not a lot of land. A single state in the US took up millions of acres so the inn, which was still only in the hundreds of thousands, was minuscule. Adding a new location also meant making alterations to the various transport systems available at the inn to include it. Train tracks were laid down, roads were cut through grass, the path of the lazy river was altered, and Lex finally also added an airport. As amazing as it would be to have helicopters fly guests around the inn, they were much too noisy and inefficient. With Xeon as a member of the inn now, Lex had him purchase a few hundred ships via the guild room and optimize them for the inn's use. Massive jets capable of vertical takeoffs while staying completely silent filled the garages in the airports. Each jet was capable of carrying anywhere between 100 to 300 guests at a time, and could traverse the entire length of the inn in merely a couple of minutes only because they kept their acceleration within comfort levels even for mortals. Naturally, a couple of other airports were also included at the other areas of the inn. With transportation taken care of, it was time to look at the layout of the new settlement. But first, Lex wanted to give it a name. Continuously calling it a settlement or development was tedious. Lex's naming sense wasn't the best, but since he had decided to do things properly, he didn't let them make him do things half-heartedly. Each area of the inn had been designed with a purpose in mind. Main Street was where the guests who only wanted a quiet or peaceful vacation went, and the aesthetic and feel of the area matched it. The village, instead, was a happening place with stadiums, parks, coliseums, concert halls, and anything else that spoke of entertainment, and thus was designed with that in mind. This new area was supposed to be a gathering place for the more adventurous guests, with the intentions of visiting the minor realms, or perhaps as a resting area before heading off to dangerous places outside of the inn. Other than eventually gathering all the entrances to the minor halls here, Lex wanted to fill this place with training halls, the eventual armory he would open, pharmacies, equipment shops, and anything else that would aid a guest about to venture off on a perilous journey. In the same breath, he had to remember that such guests were not usually fond of overly complicated or embellished names. Something simple and direct would suffice. After crossing off dozens of ideas, and thoroughly going through dictionaries and thesauruses, Lex settled on the name Immortal Bastion. It would be a place where warriors could come for their final rest before war, a safe haven where they could prepare themselves in every sense before venturing into the unknown. With the name decided, Lex got to work. Since this latest edition was planned to be over a large area rather than concentrated around one spot, there could be no city center or main area where a few important services were centered. While this could obviously not be implemented for everything, most services had to be readily available throughout the development. Lex began by setting down 100 small villages spread out over a large area, and around them began putting down small and large houses as well as courtyards. Training rooms, meditation rooms, and guild room branches were added every mile. He also added a prominent chapel-like building repeatedly where he would eventually add entrances to the minor realms. If someone wanted to visit a specific minor realm, they would have to go to a specific chapel, but if they wanted to enter one randomly, they only needed to go to the nearest one. Speaking of looking for specific minor realms, Lex had assigned workers to compile all the data available for each minor realm that his guests exited from. They would eventually be named and labeled, so that it was easier to identify them. Lex began working on the minor details of the bastion, adding various monuments, fountains, parks and such to bring life to the area. But even before he had finished, the bastion began attracting attention. Exploring the inn had become like a game to many, especially after the latest midnight letterhead told a story of a guest who discovered a hidden chest containing a ticket to a 1-month free stay at the inn. During the hunt for minor realms, many of the small, hidden rewards Lex had hid around the inn had finally been discovered. Just as Lex had expected, that had increased the guests' interest in exploring the more remote areas of the inn, slowly uncovering the various scenic spots hidden around. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 522 Grand Prix. Although at the moment the immortal bastion was nothing more than an empty shell, with time Lex would turn it into a huge gathering spot for all kinds of adventurers. Until then, it would have to stay just as a large gathering spot for various kinds of residencies. After a couple of weeks, once more entrances to minor realms were discovered, he would shift a few undiscovered ones and move them here. But all of that was for later. The reason he was in a rush to complete the bastion now was because the Grand Prix was about to begin. Last-minute changes to the course would have to be made to include the bastion, and Lex kept himself separated from it so that he would not have any unfair advantages during the race. After all, he had thoroughly enjoyed the previous race and wanted to compete fairly. Moreover, the list of other racers was quite interesting as well. Lex teleported to his room to take a short nap before the race began. He did not feel tired, mentally or physically, but he had been awake for multiple days in a row once again, and although physically he did not need it, it was tough to break the psychological habit of needing to sleep. Fortunately, although his breakthrough made it so that he did not need sleep, it did not interfere with his ability to fall asleep at all. When he woke up from his dreamless sleep, Lex felt a tinge of dissatisfaction. He did not feel refreshed at all, because he was not tired to begin with. Never in his life did Lex think that he would complain of feeling too energetic and fresh, but it was taking away from one of his favorite activities. Shaking his head, Lex put the matter behind him. He dressed up casually, put on his Clark Kent glasses, and teleported to the inn. A massive crowd had gathered at the village for that was both the starting and ending line for the race. Stadiums were filled to the brim with families and cheering fans, all supporting their favorite racers. Although Leo himself had only done a single race, mostly to get eligibility, most others had done quite a few races. Their intentions were to get used to the dynamics of the race and develop personal strategies, but they were in for a surprise. The format for the final race had been changed. Instead of 3 laps of the track, there would only be 1 lap. The first to cross the finish line would be the winner. But, in exchange for this rule change, the rack had been made much larger. Not only did it go across every major attraction at the inn, the traps and tricks were kicked up a notch. Regardless of the changes, due to the fact that Leo had only participated in 1 race, his following was not as large as others, though his unique style of winning his only race had still won him some fans. Moreover, stories of how he defeated countless nascent cultivators had also raised his popularity a bit. But it was only a bit. Compared to others, such as Brandon Morrison, Alexander's grandfather, Fardy, Greta Noel the famous strip poker player, the extremely handsome Gerard, the big brother of the NZ, and a few others, he was not that outstanding. Moreover, Lex was certain that the participants had been extremely limited because most of those whose cultivation level was very high were still cultivating. Despite that, there were well over 100 contestants in the Grand Prix. But Lex didn't mind his lack of popularity, that wasn't why he had been participating in the first place. Wearing a carefree smile, Lex got into his highly modified golf cart and made himself comfortable. Unlike the previous race, where he had been near the front, this time Lex was in the absolute last row of racers. It did not matter. The race was long enough to make up for any tiny disadvantage the starting position would give. Ladies and gents, a charismatic voice boomed over the crowds, devils and dames, beasts and spirits. I'm your favorite commentator, Arai, here with you on the first ever golf cart Grand Prix. The crowd burst into an excited cheer, jumping up and down at their seats. It wasn't just the stadium that had such a reaction. Due to the convenience provided by the inn of being able to watch all events from personal screens anywhere inside the inn, from the peak of the Midnight Mountain to the floating rubber donuts in the lazy river, guests were watching the race. Although most kids lacked the attention span for such a thing, some of the older ones inside the spaceship made themselves comfortable in their bean bags, ready with their chips and nuggets to snack as they watched. Alright contestants, get inside your vehicles as I walk you through the upcoming event. The screens that everyone other than the contestants could see started to show the track as the racers would experience them while the commentator continued to talk. Unlike previous races, this one will only have a single lap, so there's no time to familiarize yourself with the track, and you'll have to deal with the surprises as they come. The power-ups are all the same that you've already experienced, but the obstacles you will face are all new. The crowds cheered once again while the racers psyched themselves up using their various ways. The betting, which had been open for quite a while now, was about to close. Lex himself did not bother to bet, for whether he won or lost, he would be the one making the payment. The rest of the racers, though, all bet on themselves as a show of confidence. The favorite to win the race was Gerard, and Lex couldn't blame anyone for thinking as such. He'd had the perfect record so far in any race he participated in, but that was only so far. Lex tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the commentator finally finished explaining the race to everyone. Finally, in front of all the racers, Little Blue appeared in the sky, surrounded by red water. A moment later the water turned yellow, alongside a loud siren, and a moment later, turned green. The race had begun. Chapter 523 Interesting. Unlike the previous race, where Lex had a very aggressive start, he decided to drive a little more tamely this time. The primary reason for that was the fact that every other racer around him was driving like a maniac. He had not progressed 10 feet, 3 meters, forward when the first cart crashed into him. Lex had immediately deployed defensive techniques to keep his cart safe, but the thing was so had everyone else. Like hooligans, everyone drove left and right, pushing everyone beside them off the track or trying to damage their vehicle. Since the only techniques one could use were defensive, the only way to attack other contestants was to use the power-ups, or to crash the cart itself into them. When it came to the matter of a physical contest, everyone was fairly confident in their own defensive techniques, so if such rough driving continued, the first to be disqualified would be those whose techniques failed first. Lex did not think for even a moment that someone could breach his defense using only golf carts, but at the same time he was not planning on relying on such mundane tactics for knockouts. The severe lack of speed and close distance between all the racers made it hard for Lex to avoid getting crashed into, so he didn't even try. Instead, he entered into the state of flow and honed on to what his intuition told him. Instead of trying to avoid crashes, Lex began to maneuver his cart so that instead of pushed aside, he would be pushed forward. His perception of time seemed to slow down as Lex applied the limited knowledge he had gained of drifting to angle his cart just right beforehand so that when the inevitable crash came, he would move along his desired path. Since the beginning of the race had been so chaotic and exciting, the crowds were going wild while Arai could only comment on some of the crowd favorites. Gerard was in the lead, his ingenious use of his bloodline allowing him to escape the chaos before anyone else. Even the nearest racer was far behind the racing savant, not to mention still embroiled in the mess. But, suddenly, from the corner of his eye, Arai saw something very unusual. Between all the madness that seemed to be sucking everyone in, one cart seemed to be moving with the chaos, as if it were a ship sailing over stormy waters. Wait a minute folks, turn your attention to cart number 69. Arai spoke with the excitement of a child. The driver seems to be using the other carts to his advantage. The random madness, when seen from the perspective of the cart, seemed a carefully orchestrated plan designed to gain every possible inch over the competition. The other carts are not obstacles in its path, but the wind beneath its proverbial wings. It's gliding through. He just passed number 50, oh no wait, yes, he gracefully took the attack from fan favorite Brandon and bounced off of the underdog, Vice Captain Booty, and he managed to push himself out of the crowd. By the time it took the crown to find the cart the commentator was talking about, Lex had already pushed away from the remaining carts. But the race had only begun, and he was not the first to escape either. He floored the accelerator as he spread his spirit sense up ahead to check the track for traps. The track started at the stadium but did not leave the village immediately. Instead, it seemed to be diverted towards the heart of the village, where the giant orb of water floated in the sky. After a sharp turn through which Lex was able to drift beautifully, Lex finally saw the first contestant ahead of him. He did not recognize the man dressed in a giant black hood, but that didn't. A section of the road underneath the racer in front of Lex sprung up from the ground, a massive spring connected underneath keeping the road bouncing up and down. The contestant had been launched vertically into the air, but his forward momentum kept him moving. For a moment Lex thought he had fallen for a trap, but then Lex saw the racer land effortlessly in a different section of the track, bypassing the ordinary path completely. Cart number 13 takes the lead. Arai suddenly roared as an image of him jumping up and down from excitement was shown in a corner of everyone's screens. Gerard, in cart number 01, has fallen behind. What an ingenious move by the contestant called Zenmaz, although it remains to be seen if it was skill or dumb luck. Lex himself was unsure of how the other had done so, but he did not try to emulate him. Even with his intuition, it was impossible to predict what kind of trap would be triggered, so every time he sensed danger, he made sure to avoid it. And there were many such instances. Disguised almost perfectly, Lex actually ended up overlooking several traps with his spirit sense, and would have been a victim to them were it not for his intuition. But since his methods were working, Lex would not waste time dwelling on it, for the first real challenge finally appeared. In front of him, Lex saw a shining golden box in the middle of the road. That would be a power-up, something he should have been excited for. But directly behind the power-up, the road began inclining upwards. Slowly at first, but eventually the incline changed from being gentle to directly being vertical, aiming towards the floating orb of water in the sky. This was not in any of the plans for the race Lex had seen. Although Lex had told Mary to overlook the design of the race, and that he would directly approve it through the system without looking at the plans, this was pushing it, no? But before his brain could fry, he noticed other drivers going up the vertical road. It seemed their carts were not falling off, and had been kept attached to the road somehow. Interesting, he said, driving straight into the power-up. Chapter 524, Just Getting Started. The moment Lex drove through the power-up, a button on his Golf that was previously gray turned blue. Lex clicked his tongue in annoyance, but didn't focus on it for too long. He, like every other participant in the race, had memorized all the available power-ups and how to identify them. There were 3 buttons on the golf cart, each of which would turn a certain color based on the power-up he received. Once he used up a power-up, the button would once again turn gray, meaning he could hoard up to 3 power-ups at a time at most. The blue power-up wasn't actually bad, but it was designed for someone who was trailing in the race. It would give the racer a temporary speed boost, its speed and duration based on how far behind he was. Although Lex could not tell for certain, since the entire track was not visible to him, he was fairly certain he was in the top 10, so the boost would be short and tame. But beggars couldn't be choosers. Lex's cart started going up the incline, the acceleration clearly dropped as the engine used more power to keep it climbing. Lex felt nervous about the climb, but there was no other track for him to follow. The gradient of the climb kept increasing, and kept slowing Lex down, right up until it reached about 50 degrees. Lex felt a subtle shift in the way the cart was moving, and guessed that a hidden formation had been activated because gravity no longer seemed to be pulling him down towards the ground, and instead the direction of gravity was the road itself. As if that wasn't enough, the speed of his cart skyrocketed and within moments, he found himself driving vertically up and reaching the floating orb. The speed boost explained why everyone else was so far ahead of him that he could barely see anyone. The only reason Lex could even see Zenmaz was because he had skipped the track for the orb entirely. The track went through a small tunnel right in the orb, and Lex once again entered his state of flow. His accelerated speed greatly tested his reaction time, and the tunnel going through the water was swerving left and right, making it hard for Lex to anticipate the upcoming path. But due to his ever-increasing experience with drifting, his intuition and his state of flow, Lex did not slow down at all as he navigated the water tunnel. Due to the fact that Lex never slowed down, he quickly caught up to the driver right ahead of him, but he immediately noticed something off. Even if the driver had slowed down for the turns, as someone who had gone through the preliminary round, he shouldn't have needed to slow down this much to navigate the tunnel. His intuition suddenly blared a warning for upcoming danger, and Lex did not hesitate to swerve his steering wheel as hard as he could, pull the handbrake and hit the power-up button at the same time. "Drift King Leo is at it again," roared the commentator as his body trembled from the adrenaline rush. The camera quickly cut to Lex, showing what happened in slow motion. One moment he was going straight, and the next moment he started moving diagonally, while actually increasing his speed somehow. The next moment, the screen showed Leo's cart dodging a spear that had been launched from the water right underneath the track. The spear was hard to see due to it being underneath the track that was now made of water, and its timing had been perfect. Yet the smooth evasive maneuver pulled off by Leo and his calm expression told that everything was within his control. Countless guests were beginning to switch their loyalty towards Leo, clearly impressed by his skill, when he discovered a secret none of the drivers before him had considered. The shift in gravity had not resulted from the track, but from within the cart itself. Leo had drifted right to the top of the tunnel, passing the contestant ahead of him while driving literally right above him. Leo ended the drift and continued to the race, his cart not slowing down for even a moment the entire time. With that single move, Leo had determined himself as one of the favorites for the race, but it was unknown if his stellar performance would continue. After all, the race had just begun, and many were already catching up behind him. Lex himself was not nearly as calm as he appeared. He had just become too used to masking his emotions and keeping a calm demeanor. But internally, he was feeling exhilarated. The fact that he had dodged that single spear seemed to have incensed the track, if that was possible, and countless other traps kept appearing in his way. But he kept avoiding them effortlessly, and he was having the time of his life doing it. He recalled long ago, when he had wished for more excitement in his life. For a time after that, he regretted making such a wish, mostly because he was always being hunted by zombies or wolves or miscellaneous bad guys, but right now he was having the time of his life. There was something about going fast, the wind in his hair, dodging all obstacles, continuing on his path unimpeded. His inner monologue ended quite abruptly when his cart suddenly slipped. Right in front of him there was a cart pile-up, and due to his increased speed and loss of control, there didn't seem to be a way to avoid crashing. He immediately entered the overdrive state and realized what had happened. On Earth, thin, nearly invisible layers of ice that formed on roads were called black ice, mostly due to the color of the road beneath them. Regardless of what it was called, the point was that it was an imperceptible layer of ice that covered the track, or in this case, was what the track had turned into. For the first time in the race, Lex hit the brakes without the intention of drifting. But he was not aiming to slow down, either. Suddenly hitting the brakes caused the cart to skid even more, turning sideways as it continued to hurl towards the pile-up. But just as it approached, Lex shifted his left leg out the open side of the cart and stomped the track using his immense physical strength. Unanimously, the crowd's jaws dropped as they saw Leo jump the cart sideways, using the very limited free space between the pile-up and the tunnel roof or base, depending on how you looked at it, and pass through without touching a single other vehicle. Once the cart landed on the other side, it did a single, 360-degree swerve while Lex regained control and just kept on driving. He exited the overdrive state as soon as he crossed the hurdle, his heart beating like a drum during a rock concert. He had never been in any physical danger, but the thought of finally stumbling across an obstacle seemed more daunting than any real danger at that point. Once across, though, he felt like laughing. He was Lex, the freaking innkeeper. He was Leo, the owner of Gamer's Den. Simple obstacles such as these couldn't faze him. In the distance, Lex saw a bright light, indicating the end of the water tunnel, finally. He had already seen bits of the track that came next and knew that vines were going to be the next big obstacle, but he wasn't worried. With his intuition he was. Fudge, he roared in his mind the moment he exited the tunnel, because there was no track. He had been launched straight into the clouds, with no track beneath him and no indication of where he was supposed to land. He spread his spirit sense as far and wide as he could to search for where he was supposed to go next, but it was useless. Slowly and predictably, he reached the arch of his launch. For a single, uncertain moment, he hovered in the air, before he began plummeting through the sky. Unsure of what to expect, since he was still within the clouds, his view completely blocked, Lex began using his defensive techniques to ensure the cart would survive the crash when, abruptly and unexpectedly, he sensed a track. He slammed the accelerator even before he landed. His defensive technique had been employed just in time as his cart bounced on the ground once before firmly planting itself on the ground and continuing forward. He burst through the clouds to realize where he was. He was in the floating city above the village, on a track that was completely separate from the one he had seen on the ground. How would this work? He didn't have time to ponder as his intuition kicked in, warning of an attack coming from behind him. Lex recognized the sound of incoming artillery, and knew that someone behind him had used a power-up targeting him. Chapter 525 100,000 Bated Breaths. Lex recognized the distinct sound of cloth flapping in the wind and knew exactly what power-up was coming for him. It was troubling because this particular power-up had a homing function, so it wasn't easy to avoid. This was not a matter of defense, and he dared say that even if he used talk to the hand and put up a barrier, it would not be enough to escape from the effects of this particular power-up. If he still had the speed boost power-up, he could have used it at the right moment to escape, but since he did not, he would have to get creative. Without even needing to think about it, he entered the state of flow and drove his cart to the edge of the track. Relying on his keen intuition, his incredible sense of hearing and his spirit sense that he had surrounded his cart with, he waited for the power-up to come just close enough. 1 second, 2. Before the third second could arrive, Lex struck his hand out of the cart and grabbed onto a street light just off the track. Latching onto the cart as tightly as he could, he used his grip on the street light as a pivot and had the cart spin a full circle around the pole, abruptly moving out of its original trajectory. Just as he was about to get back onto the track, he saw a massive white blanket throw itself where his cart should have been. This was a power-up called the mummy wrap, and basically consisted of a white, indestructible blanket that would completely wrap itself around the moving golf carts, obstructing not only the view but also the spirit senses. It lasted an enormous 10 seconds, which was long enough for a speed cart to crash somewhere or go off course directly. More importantly, it provided the driver right behind to overtake the competition. From the corner of his eye, Lex noticed a driver catching up to him. He immediately recognized the infamous Noelle's sister, Greta. Although she was too far for Lex to hear what she was screaming, his phenomenal eyesight allowed him to read her lips and pick up on some of the curse words she was using. It seemed she was upset over Lex dodging her power-up. The crowds watching, however, were all ecstatic and could not get enough of Leo's driving. To be honest, Leo was nowhere near the level of Gerard, who had yet to enter a single precarious situation at all. But it was the constant close calls that got the viewer's adrenaline pumping, and his ever-stoic expression that elevated his image. But Lex could not be bothered by any of that now. An intersection in the track was coming up. On the left, Lex could clearly see a power-up floating within reach, but the right path was descending away back to the track below. Lex had neither the time to debate his options nor the will to gamble. In such a moment, he relied completely on his intuition, and turned towards the left path. The button for the power-ups turned red, making Lex grin. The kamikaze bomber was perceived as one of the more useless power-ups, considering it caused a powerful explosion right on the user's cart. But for Lex and his incredible defense, that was not a problem at all. Moreover, it provided him with an excellent way to remove competitors as long as he got close enough. It could also help him avoid certain other power-ups targeting him as well. A very versatile tool. But though he got the power-up, he had to pay the corresponding price. The track led him right off the edge of the floating city, driving on a path made of clouds. But his intuition was blaring, letting him know that not all clouds were solid and he could easily plummet to the ground. He was not afraid of falling from heights, but rather losing his position in the race. He could no longer tell what position he was at, but he was sure it was probably near the front. With no safety guard rails to keep him on track, and his intuition only warning him where there was danger, Lex's driving seemed to become haphazard. Many viewers became confused for a moment, before their screens suddenly highlighted the actual track in green, and all the clouds that would allow Lex to fall as red. Sucking in a quick, cold breath, they finally realized just how precarious Lex's situation was. To be fair, anyone with a keen observation would also be able to detect the correct path due to how the clouds behaved differently, where they were solid and where they weren't, but no one had the time for that. A few tense minutes later, Lex finally got off the clouds. But that did not mean his track had become any easier to navigate. He had gotten off at the tip of Midnight Mountain and now had to drive down a snowy track spiraling across the mountainside. Just as he was trying to get an understanding of how the cart drove on a snowy track, a cart literally fell out of the sky in front of him. The cart, which was covered in a golden bubble, did not slow down even for a second and continued to hurtle directly down the mountainside with no regard for the track. "Brandon, you juvenile geezer," roared someone from another cart, which also crashed down from the sky. But this one did not have the smooth landing of the previous one, and became completely buried in the heavy snow. Lex didn't pay them much mind and continued to navigate the track, but more and more carts started falling from the sky. Instead of competitors, they became more like obstacles for Lex to avoid. But other than falling from the heavens, the carts also had another thing in common: they were all cursing Brandon. Lex didn't know if he should be curious as to what the old man had done, or impressed by the sheer damage he had caused. But Lex put him out of his thoughts real quick as his keen senses picked up another power-up hidden underneath a pile of snow. Taking a small risk of slowing down, Lex drove headfirst into the pile to gain his second stacked power-up. The second button turned green. This made Lex grin. This power-up had been suggested by one of his workers who had been watching Popsicle the Sailor Man and his penchant for gaining great strength when eating spinach. This power-up would not really increase the speed of his cart, but if he rammed into anyone and hit the button, their cart would literally be thrown away as if hit by a powerful ram. Of course, there were ways of negating this ability, just like any other, but it was easier said than done. Lex continued down the mountain, still managing to avoid all obstacles, but soon a general cacophony began to trail him as all the drivers who fell out of the sky re-entered the race. That in itself wasn't an issue since Lex's driving, which allowed him to avoid slowing down at all, would continue to increase the distance between them. It was the threat of being targeted by power-ups that put pressure on Lex. Not to mention, he really didn't like this pattern of people overtaking him by breaking through or going off course. Since going off the course, to a small degree, was technically allowed, many restrictions had been put in place to discourage anyone from attempting such things or make it hard for them to gain any leads using these methods. But two people had already managed to do it. It seemed like they really had profited from going through multiple races. Lex had to admit that he had overestimated himself and underestimated others. But, if others could do it, so could he. Lex entered his overdrive state and began analyzing the track ahead of him, or as much of it as he could see. He had already determined where the track would proceed once he exited the mountain, so. A few patient minutes went by as Lex searched for the perfect spot, but the moment he found it, he did not hesitate. Without any forewarning whatsoever, Lex veered to the right and, driving over a tree that had been growing at an angle, Lex launched himself off the mountain. As the sunlight shone down on the cart flying through the air like a Pegasus, lighting up the faint, confident smile worn by Leo, a hush fell over a certain part of the stadium full of guests who had been watching him. 100,000 guests held their breath as they watched him fly. In a particular corner, a devil wearing a brown trench coat pulled out a small booklet from his pocket, and with a tiny yellow pencil, wrote down Leo. A few familiar names above him were Gerard, Marlowe, and Luther. Z's name was also mentioned, but it had a question mark right in front of it. Chapter 526, Gelid Anima. For a few brief seconds, Lex was flying through the sky. He was cutting through the track faster than he should have been allowed, and it was only now that he was breaking the rules that he was able to see that dozens of racers had already surpassed him somehow. But he wasn't stressed or alarmed at the thought of being overtaken. The race was too much fun, and encountering others who were able to surpass his expectations just lit his competitive spirit on fire. At that moment, something unusual happened. Lex entered a state completely unlike any he had experienced. The first abnormal state he had ever encountered was the flow state. The reason he called it the flow state was because it allowed him to perform every single action with absolute perfection and efficiency, something that was impossible for him to do under normal circumstances. Even with his increased brain power and control due to his raised cultivation, he could not match the precision the flow state afforded him. His actions seemed to flow from one to the next without a break or pause, or the need to think and analyze. It was like achieving the hypothetical peak performance he was capable of unleashing. The first time he had used it was long before he had any combat skill or sense of his own, yet he was surrounded by a horde of zombies, impossible for him to overcome. But in that moment that should have led to his death, he did not freeze, nor he did not cower. Instead, overcame the limits of his own experiences and killed his way out. The next unusual state he had encountered was the overdrive state. That, once again, had come to Lex when he was faced with death. Regardless of how incompetent he himself was, the host of the murder system had been extremely dangerous. Although Lex was the ultimate victor, had his performance lacked even a bit, he would have been a victim to that man's immense luck. The overdrive state allowed him to push his mind and body beyond its normal limits, achieving what he normally would not have at the expense of great exhaustion. In fact, Lex had long suspected that the toll of the overdrive state would have absolutely wrecked his body had he lacked the foundation of the regal embrace. While both those states were incredibly useful, and Lex had used them often, a trait they both had in common was that they would completely subdue his emotions. While Lex did not become completely emotionless, he was largely ruled by logic and the urgency of the tasks on hand. The results had not been contrary to what Lex wanted, but it seemed more like achieving the result on autopilot than doing, because it satisfied his emotions. In practice, that made no real difference, and Lex never really even considered it a drawback worth mentioning, considering both the states allowed him to go above and beyond what he normally could not. But this new state, it was the opposite. Perhaps one of the reasons Lex never encountered it before was because he was unable to physically support it. His stamina started draining rapidly as he felt each and every muscle in his body tense up and relax, readily filling him with a strength that would have otherwise required immense concentration and focus. His already fast reaction speed was kicked up a notch. His already racing thoughts were boosted beyond anything he could achieve on his own, making him feel like the world was moving in slow motion. Moreover, instead of his emotions being suppressed and his mind making the most efficient decisions, his emotions were excited beyond measure, and he was left with the ultimate freedom to do as he desired. While the previous two states were focused mostly on his mind and making his actions efficient, this one boosted his physical skills to the max and drove his emotions into a frenzy. It was like he was given a toy and allowed to do whatever he wanted. With the only small difference being that his own body and immense strength were the toys, and what he wanted to do was win. The moment his cart landed on the ground, and Lex became slightly accustomed to this new berserk state, he came to a new understanding of what was happening. He had assumed that because the race was organized by the system and the event panel, no one would be able to cheat. But he completely forgot that he himself was always looking for loopholes in everything related to the system. As such, it only made sense that such was also possible during the race. With a mad grin that had an eerie resemblance to Marlowe's signature look, Lex floored the accelerator. Suddenly, not only did he want to win the race, he wanted to do it while causing more chaos than even Brandon. William was sitting in his room, looking over a document. Damien had sent it to the inn, and insisted that he take a look over it. While William originally had all his attention focused on Lex, after reading this document, he was greatly interested in his sisters as well. But, most importantly, as a leader of the human race, he was most interested in their mother, Serene Williams. "How did you do it?" he murmured as he read the document again and again. His eyes kept switching to a few key points, trying to wrap his head around it. The most important points were: Belle Williams, born with the heart of a Valkyrie. Liz Williams, born with mythical 100% compatibility to Beastmaster path. Moon Williams, born with mutated soul sense that allows her to aid immortals during the mind tribulation. Any three of these abilities were actually genuinely unheard of in the human race, yet all three had occurred in siblings. What was driving him crazy was that if the parents had not chosen to hide these astounding abilities, what was it about Lex that caused them to hide him? But, regardless of whatever ability Lex had, he was more interested in Serene, who had somehow achieved this. Not that he was looking down on Leon, Lex's father, but his entire life was documented, so there was no reason to believe he had the ability to do anything so remarkable. In fact, before meeting Serene, even Leon's skills were somewhat mediocre, at least as far as the entire Jotun Empire was concerned. After meeting her, however, his prowess with the sword seemed to have increased. Unfortunately, he would not get the answer to his question anytime soon, since Leon and Serene had disappeared without a trace. But William's reverie suddenly broke when he felt a chance from within his own body. The so-called bloodline of the Williams family was actually just a watered-down version of skills he had developed on his own. The bloodline was something his descendants could unlock, though he himself lacked any such bloodline. Yet at that moment, which was coincidentally the same moment Lex entered his berserk state, William Sephor, founder of the William family and creator of the gelid anima bloodline, felt himself gaining a bloodline. Chapter 527 All's Fair. Alexander Morrison was sitting alone and pondering fate. He did not know if it existed, and there was no real answer even with the Jotun Empire. He had heard a few odd mentions of the term destiny, but even then he had never managed to gain any insight about its existence. But if fate, or destiny, or whatever else existed, it was such a strange thing. It was a thing beyond his understanding, genuinely. Someone could be born with so much, only to learn that all that he has is not actually worth so much. Or, sometimes, in life nothing significant would happen for so long, and when important events started happening, they all happened at the same time. His thoughts were in chaos, not really following any certain path. Through the Empire's guidance and the use of the Inn's excellent facilities and services, he had once again returned to the Golden Core realm. He had also become much more powerful than he had ever been, which is exactly what he wanted. But for reasons he could not understand, he still felt a strange emptiness. There was an anxiousness in his chest he could not quieten and an irritation that ate away at his mind he could not comprehend. He had experienced this feeling a couple times before, but every time he did, he would throw himself into some training or battle, but currently he could do neither. From an early age, he had been trained to overcome every obstacle and continuously surpass himself, so he wasn't really the type to ignore a little bit of anxiety. The problem was, try as he might, he just could not understand what the cause of the feeling was. "What's her name?" asked a stranger sitting beside Alexander. The young man was genuinely startled. So lost in his thoughts was he, that he had completely forgotten his surroundings and let down his guard, completely missing the stranger who approached him. But looking at him, the stranger looked no older than him, and seemed just as weary as him, if not more. "I'm sorry, what?" he asked, unsure what the question had meant. But his question only caused the other to chuckle. "I know that look well, friend. I know it so well. It's a girl. It's always a girl." For a moment, he fell silent again, looking down at the ground in front of him. "Sometimes I wonder what's the point of it all. What's the point of being born into a wealthy family if it keeps you from doing what you want? What's the point of a strong cultivation if you're not strong enough to be with the one you love?" The stranger's body trembled as he seemed to be holding himself back from doing something drastic. Eventually, though, the intensity faded and the man let out a defeated sigh. "Please excuse me," he said, looking down at the ground, somehow feeling it an impossible task to look up at Alexander. "I was supposed to reunite with my girlfriend at the inn. She's the most beautiful girl in the world with the most beautiful name, Aisha. But it's been an entire year, yet she has never appeared again." If Lex had seen this scene, he would have recognized the boy as Hares, one of the two teenage lovers who had been guests at the inn in its early days. Yet now he lacked the vibrancy and vigor of youth he had back then. I suspect our families have done something behind our back." Abruptly, Horace stood up. "Sorry for rambling. I've been like that these past few days." Without waiting for a response, he disappeared from the inn, his eyes filled with exhaustion, but also conviction. Alexander was left feeling bewildered about the strange encounter. But the encounter had also prompted him to think about a name he hadn't thought of in so long, Helen. She too had disappeared so long ago, and had never returned. Alexander did not even realize his hand had clenched into a fist. A Jotun soldier ran out of a minor realm, a rather hidden one that no one else had discovered so far, in a panic. The moment he returned to the inn, he immediately requested his personal hologram to contact General Ragnar. Although the soldier was an insignificant nobody who should not have even had the authority to converse with the general ever, he believed he would be forgiven for the transgression when he shared the news he had discovered. The race's intensity had not decreased as time went on, but had only gotten more extreme. Lex was currently driving on a platform only 15 feet wide. It seemed plenty, honestly, if one overlooked the fact that the platform was attached to an extremely long, moving train. Moreover, Lex had closed the distance with those ahead of him, meaning he shared the platform with several other racers. So not only did he have to manage the momentum of his own speeding cart, but anticipate centrifugal force applied every time the train itself turned around a bend while also dodging the carts racing beside him. But, Lex being in a berserk state, wasn't really in the mood for carefully dodging all the carts and driving past them. Hitting his power-up that allowed him to ram opponents away, he directly crashed into the cart in front of him. The cart alongside its driver, a familiar demon called Pramod, were hurled directly into the air. This might have worked to his benefit, throwing them far ahead of everyone, if he hadn't been using a power-up of his own, binding his cart with that of a racer in front of him. The two carts pulling each other in different directions were ultimately swept directly off the track and fell somewhere on the side. Laughing with triumph, Lex made his way to the front of the train where there was a boosted ramp that would launch him off the platform and back onto the real track. But how could things be so easy? Right behind him was Z, the big brother of the inn, and direct employee of Leo. Although Z was not vindictive by nature, something about watching his boss have the time of his life while Z himself worked endlessly brought out a side of him he had never known. All's fair in video games and war, he thought to himself and activated his bloodline. Chapter 528 Short Sprint. During the golf cart racing, using any techniques to attack was not allowed. But as Lex had already clearly learned, there were clearly ways one could work around the rules. Regalia Bloom was the bloodline that the inn-workers had, and allowed the user to manipulate energy through weapons or items. While Gerard, who had now undergone 2 bloodline evolutions, could use the ability a lot more freely than the rest, Z himself also had exceptional skill. His eyes took on a silver color and his cart was covered in a similar silver hue. While he was unable to make his cart fly using his bloodline in the way Gerard did, there were other things he could do. He smashed down an orange button, using his power-up that activated boosters behind the cart, giving it a massive speed boost. The cart shot forward like a rocket and slammed directly into LX's cart. Or, it almost did. A massive, invisible shield had appeared right behind Lex, saving him from getting rammed. He had used Talk to the Hand, and that should have been the end of it. After all, Z had crashed into an impenetrable wall at maximum speed. His cart should have been crushed. But not only was his cart fine, the silver hue around it started to grow brighter. A moment later, to Lex's genuine and complete surprise, the so-called impenetrable defense that he had relied on vanished. Z's cart, which still had its boosters active, crashed into Lex's cart. But something unusual happened. Instead of being knocked out of the way, Lex's cart suddenly started losing its momentum before turning off completely. Due to his magnified emotions, for the first time Lex ended up breaking his stoic expression, replacing it with a look of surprise. He did not understand what had happened, but he could clearly tell Z was responsible as he moved past Lex and zoomed away. But surprised though he may be, Lex reacted quickly. He hit the button to turn his cart back on and, fortunately, nothing was broken, so it turned back on perfectly fine. Although the functionality of the berserk state was different from the overdrive state, the function of both of them was founded on Lex's own capabilities. Even without the mental boost from his other state, Lex was able to determine quickly what had actually happened. Z had absorbed all the energy not only from his own crash into Lex's defense, but all the spiritual energy that powered Talk to the Hand. While theoretically possible, this was not an easy feat at all, and only became possible because many factors aligned perfectly. The first was that Talk to the Hand was not suited for use in the Golden Core, so although it was seemingly stronger with him using it in the Golden Core realm, it was also more unstable, which allowed Z to easily take control of the energy that made up the technique. The second was when their carts connected when Z rammed him. Instead of trying to knock him off the track, Z absorbed the energy that his golf cart was using to function. The lapse in energy caused the machine to stall, and then shut down. Finally, Z channeled all that energy which, technically, he had absorbed to protect his cart from suffering from the repercussions of multiple collisions, and channeled it to the boosters that had activated from the power-up. The result was silver flames that shot his cart far ahead of Lex, the source of the energy itself. Despite being beaten badly, Lex didn't feel bad. It was actually quite amusing to encounter such unpredictable situations. But at the same time, if he wanted to win, he better stop letting others get a lead on him. If he had been in his emotionless, overdrive state, Lex would have come up with some ingenious plan that maximized his efficiency and won that way. But since he was going berserk, and he also wanted to create a bigger spectacle than Brandon, he did something completely unexpected. He jumped out of the golf cart and lifted it over his head, pressing down on the accelerator with his hand so that the cart was going at full speed when he was ready to set it back down. Then, using the ridiculous boost to his physical abilities the berserk state afforded him, he started running. Technically, this was not him using any techniques and just running. The fact that his normal running speed in a short sprint was ridiculous was inconsequential, as he was not breaking any rules. The soldier who had run out of the minor realm came scurrying back, but this time he was followed by General Ragnar, as well as two other people he did not recognize. But since the general allowed the man and woman to follow him, they must have sufficient standing. "This is the realm, General," he said, between breaths. Despite his cultivation in the Golden Core, he was extremely tired, which showed just how much energy he had exerted on delivering the news as fast as possible. "Has anyone entered the pagoda?" the general asked as he stood before the realm's entrance. "A few, all at various levels. I suspect the restriction is on age and not cultivation level." "And how did you recognize the heritage?" the general asked, turning his attention to the soldier. Suddenly he recalled something and asked, "Your name is Slag, right? You were the first soldier to venture into the Midnight Inn?" "Yes, sir. The reason I recognized the heritage, sir, was that after being exposed to the inn, I made a request to transfer to the Historical Anomalies Department, sir." The Historical Anomalies Department was one that studied vague, ancient histories and vague unknown powers in the universe. Practically speaking, there was not much use to them, but in certain situations their expertise was useful. This happened to be such a situation. "Why do you think it's an age restriction and not a power level restriction?" the man beside the general asked. Slag did not hesitate to answer, for it was not in prerogative to question his superiors even if he didn't know who they were. "Sir, some of the soldiers who entered are in the same realm as me, but were able to enter, while I could only watch from the outside. Let's see if I can do anything about those restrictions," the man said, with a hint of excitement in his voice. Chapter 529 Hallelujah. As unusual as it seemed, Lex's emotions were not so exaggerated that he would end up doing something illogical. The reason he ran with the cart lifted above him instead of driving normally was because his short burst speed was much greater than the cart itself. Before long, he leaped up into the air and got back in the driver's seat, allowing the cart to fall back onto the platform. The cart swerved a bit and nearly fell off the moving train, but Lex managed to regain control. He was nearing the end of the train, which was outfitted with a jump ramp. Lex didn't even want to think about what would happen if he jumped off the train to somewhere random. He was sure the track was planned better than this. But, just as he was approaching the ramp, he heard a sound in the distance that was easily recognizable, and stiffened his expression. He turned to look in the distance and saw a massive, blue-colored explosion. That was a specific power-up that would only come out if someone was too far in the lead. Damn it, even if did end up losing, he couldn't do it without at least facing off with Gerard at least once. Lex leaped off the train, using the ramp without regard for where he would land, and it seemed his suspicions were correct. He had barely gone a few feet away from the train when he felt his cart being pulled up into the air. He looked up and saw the racing track, only it continued underneath the massive spaceship. Whoever had updated the track really loved playing with gravity. As much as Lex wanted to continue enjoying the track and experiencing all the interesting features that had been added to it, he could do that later. He had memorized where that blue explosion had taken place and a plan to get ahead formed in his mind. The cart turned upside down on its own, but that wasn't an issue because he would have to flip if he wanted to continue on the bottom portion of the spaceship. This portion of the track was extremely different, as there was no track per se. Instead, the carts were free to drive anywhere so long as they headed in the direction of a green portal that probably teleported them elsewhere. As if that wasn't enough, mini turrets would come out of the ship from time to time and shoot at the drivers. Of course, evasion at such straightforward attacks was nothing to Lex. The moment he landed on the ship he began driving, and though at first he did not attract attention since everyone assumed he was only getting adjusted to the new track, it took only a few moments for him to once again gain the attention of the audience. While everyone was driving towards the portal, Lex was actually heading away from it. No one judged him or accused him of being stupid, as he had proven his capabilities. So, everyone only wondered what he was up to, eagerly awaiting for him to provide them with a good show. But he kept driving in a straight line for a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. At this point, Lex had lost any lead he had and was trailing in the race. Everyone, even the commentator, was panicking for him. But Lex was completely calm. He looked up or down, depending on the point of view, and saw that he was directly opposite to the portion of the inn where the blue explosion had happened. He smiled, and employed one of the new defensive techniques he had picked out for himself from the vast collection he had gotten from the Infinity Emporium. It was called Introvert's Dream and created a bubble around Lex, isolating him from any unnatural external influences. While this technique couldn't protect him from any direct attacks, it had many other incredible uses. Such as, without breaking his momentum, the wheels of the cart detached from the ship and then, with increasing speed, Lex continued to fall from the sky. His technique had freed him from the influence of the artificial gravity that had brought him into the sky, allowing him to fall directly towards the end of the track. For a couple of minutes, no one noticed his descent, as they had turned their attention towards other racers who were actively competing in the races. But the moment the first person noticed a cart falling out of the sky, his excited yell alerted all the others. "It's raining men," screamed a little girl in the stadium as she pointed towards the screen. "Ha ha ha, no, not men, it's dashed," the girl's mother tried to correct her, but when she looked at the screen she paused. Behind Lex's cart, also falling from the sky, was Z. How could he have believed it was so easy to get rid of Leo? He had been directly hired by the Innkeeper, after all. Z did not care about winning, as long as he made Leo lose. So he had kept an eye on his boss throughout, and the moment he saw him deviating, a gut feeling made him follow along. Of course, there were quite a few others who also followed as well. After all, if two racers were doing something unusual, there had to be a secret, right? Since they were losing anyway, there wasn't much to lose. The result was, as the little girl so aptly put it, a rain of men alongside their carts. On the ground, a seemingly random guest crawled out of a tent and stretched under the light of the new day. She had gone camping just to get away from the crowds as, after a bad breakup, she just wanted to be alone. The excellent atmosphere of the inn and some time away from wretched men did her good, and she was already feeling better. A few more days of this and... Before she could complete her thought, Lex landed in his cart right in front of her. He had naturally employed various techniques to defend his cart from the impact, so instead of crash landing, it was as if a feather were touching down on the ground. He spared the woman no thought as he raced towards the track. If he didn't get back on in 10 seconds, he would be disqualified. The woman, instead, was momentarily startled by the descent of the handsome stranger. Then she looked up and saw the horde about to descend on her. Chapter 530, The Pagoda. Lex, of course, was well aware of the fact that he had been followed. There wasn't much he could do about that, as his only power-up at the moment was the kamikaze explosion. Fortunately, his little maneuver paid off, as he climbed back on the track with a few seconds to spare. Moreover, the massive scorch marks where the cart in the lead had been targeted let Lex know he was on the right path. Only, there was no indication of the cart that had been targeted. Lex had to assume that whoever the driver was, Gerard most likely, had somehow survived. All of them were driving the same cart? How had he even gained such a lead? Lex was genuinely curious now, and decided to watch a replay of the race after it was over. But it wasn't over yet. The track led into the massive forest that surrounded the greenhouse. This would be tricky, as he had repeatedly strengthened the formation that would disrupt an intruder's sense of direction if they ventured in too deeply, and currently he would be classified as an intruder. For once Lex withdrew his spirit sense back in, so as to not accidentally touch the formation, and readied himself for an interesting drive. But something unexpected happened. Mary appeared sitting on his shoulder, dressed up in the attire of a racer's pit crew. "There's a situation. I would have waited to contact you, but there's a guest who wants to meet with you and they're claiming it's extremely urgent." Even though Lex paid attention to what Mary said, his focus on the track had not dropped. His latest increase in cultivation made it so he could easily divide his mind into separate tasks without influencing one another, so even if he had full-fledged conversations with Mary, the amount of focus he would give to his driving would remain undiluted. "Who's the guest?" he asked out of curiosity. Since Mary herself said the situation was urgent, he doubted it was an ordinary guest. "It's Emperor Jotun and General Ragnar, alongside a lady I believe is the Emperor's wife." They all look agitated. The Emperor, the Empress, and the General. If they had all come together for an urgent matter, it wasn't something Lex could ignore. "Send them to my office," he said, deciding to meet them with his projection. "They're already there." Considering the fact that they wanted to meet urgently, Lex wasn't surprised that they were already waiting for his office. He used his remote presence to create a projection of himself sitting at his desk. Merely a moment later, the trio entered the room, allowing Lex to analyze them. He immediately realized a couple of interesting things. First, while Mary had said they were agitated, a more apt description would be that they seemed excited. It was not alarm or worry that painted their faces, but suppressed elation. Second, the sixth sense he had gained from the mystery trial could be used even through his projection. Although he had yet to say anything, he could feel it activate in preparation for the conversation they were about to happen. But before he began the conversation, he observed the woman and checked her status. Name, Eleanor Jotun. Age, 298,555. Sex, female. Cultivation details, too high for host to see. Species, human. Midnight and prestige level, 1. Remarks, stop ogling at married women. Eleanor looked more mature than her husband, though that in no way diminished her beauty. But it was not because of her beauty that Lex was paying special attention to her. It was the fact that both her eyes were of different colors. Such a thing was actually not uncommon, in mortals at least. In Eleanor's case, however, it was not so simple. Although his instincts and intuition usually failed him when it came to those whose cultivation was far higher than his own, at this moment it was telling him that if he had looked at her eyes through his left eye, and not through his projection, he would be seeing something else. But such things did not matter, for the moment at least. Lex did not wait, nor did he start the meeting with a casual conversation like their previous encounter, and instead directly asked the Emperor, "Is something the matter? I was told that you wanted to meet urgently." "Innkeeper, I wanted to make a request, though I am afraid it might seem improper." "Oh? What is it?" "Among the many minor realms that you have opened up for guests, there is one that is of special interest to us. I was hoping to ask for exclusive rights to that realm, at least for a time." The request was truly unexpected, and not at all in line with anything he was expecting. But he did not fall into a stupor at the request and immediately drew a conclusion that the Emperor found something even he found valuable. Even Lex was curious now. "As you probably know," began Lex in a somber tone, "the inn is currently having an event. Blocking off or making certain realms exclusive to certain groups during the event. Well, it is certainly not what was planned." The three did not try to hide the anxiety on their faces as they heard Lex speak, or perhaps, due to his sixth sense, he was just more perceptive of the anxiety they felt. It was an interesting ability, which allowed him to feel that he held all the power during this conversation. He did not need to beat around the bush to get them to reveal their motives, like he would have to do if he were using a different identity. Of course, that does not mean it can't be arranged. "But I'm curious, why would you pay so much attention to this specific minor realm?" The trio instantly felt relief upon knowing that the task was achievable, and the Emperor's mood even elevated immensely. "Innkeeper, you probably already know that the history of my empire is very small," he began, as his thoughts drifted into eras past. "The history of the human race is longer than that, of course, but past a few 100 million years at most, nothing is recorded. Even if I use my authority to peruse the Henali records, I can, at most, look back a couple billion years to when the Henali arrived at the origin realm." "What was the origin realm like before then? Who inhabited it? Did humans even exist in the origin realm?" These questions I have never been able to find an answer to. Some, like the Henali themselves, think it doesn't really matter. After all, back then the realm was even younger than it is now. Any being or civilization that existed back then could only be weaker than those that exist now. Certainly, they would be much weaker than myself at this point. Jotun paused to laugh, as if he had just said something amusing. "But the mysteries of the universe are beyond what we can imagine? Once, in my youth, my father took my brothers and I to a secret pagoda, from which I gained the inheritance that brought me to where I am today. If the old civilizations were weak, how could they leave behind a heritage so powerful? Just a short while ago, one of my soldiers discovered another pagoda in one of your minor realms, almost identical to the one I entered in my youth. But even now, at the pinnacle of my strength, the pagoda remains as mysterious and elusive to me as it was back then. Although it might be selfish of me to deprive this opportunity to others, that you have so selflessly provided to everyone, but I have to try, nonetheless. After all, even in the greater realms, the situation for us humans is not so great. If through this pagoda, another great heritage for the human race is uncovered, it will be a boon for humans across the universe." The Emperor provided a lot of information to Lex, not only about himself, but about the situation relating to humans across the universe. But now was not the time to mull over such things. If this pagoda was so great, Lex himself was quite interested in it. "You're talking about the benefit of the human race. What you're saying is that if I give you exclusive rights to the realm, you'll provide the heritage out to the humans instead of keeping it for yourself?" "Innkeeper, since I have already been in the pagoda once, I know how hard it is to pass its tests. I cannot enter it myself due to its restrictions, and there is no guarantee that if I only let my own progeny enter, they will ever succeed. If I have exclusive rights to the realm, I can take my time and only allow those of reliable character to enter so they may try their luck. If not, then I can only take a gamble. I have already asked Ragnar to keep his men on standby. He has approximately 300 million soldiers under his command who qualify to enter the pagoda. I can only have them enter first, while I gather more men from elsewhere to keep on entering. Chapter 531 No Negotiations. Multitasking was not really a problem for Lex anymore. The ability to split his mind to have each mind focus on a different task made it so. Moreover, the current situation only required him to have two separate trains of thought running, one focused on the racing and one focused on the conversation in his office. For a moment, however, he had to create a third split to mercilessly beat down the rising greedy, capitalistic side of himself from emerging. The thought of 300 million soldiers passing through his inn, with more on the way, set his imagination wild for how much MP he could print. But the reason he had to rein himself in was that he wasn't logistically prepared to handle such volume. All the systems he had in place would suddenly become overcrowded and overburdened. As much as he liked New York, the crowded subway at peak hour was not something he wanted to emulate. Besides, there were a few other opportunities for Lex to gain in this situation. After all, this mystical pagoda was connected to a minor realm he controlled the entrance to. There was nothing stopping him from taking a tour in it himself. But he had to learn more about it first. He had a feeling Marlowe was leaving out a lot of information about this pagoda. If your only aim is to propagate the strength of the human race, I do not see why you need to prevent others from accessing the realm. If there is a heritage suitable for the human race inside the pagoda, then humans from anywhere can reap the benefit. The pagoda does not have any specific heritage lying in wait inside. Instead, the heritage it delivers is designed according to whoever enters. The pagoda I entered in my youth was a part of a sex training grounds. Other than humans, many other races benefited from it, even if they did so nominally. But the reason I want to make the realm exclusive is not because I don't want to share. When I finally reached the top floor in the pagoda, and passed its tests, the pagoda turned into a normal building and stopped giving out heritages. It is the final heritage that I want to reserve for the human race. Lex's experience with alien races had been vastly out of the ordinary. Everyone he had met from the Jotun Empire was filled with immense devotion towards bettering the human race, but back on Earth, humans had proved that they weren't exactly saints themselves. The history of the Earth was filled with horrid cruelty, proving that his race was more than capable of being the villain in someone's story. As such, he did not understand their particular devotion towards strengthening their own race rather than following the typical route of reserving the benefits for only themselves or their close relatives. Maybe wars between races were all too common in the universe and he just hadn't been exposed to them yet. Or maybe they were just a very altruistic bunch. Either way, the opportunities provided by the pagoda seemed excellent, and Lex was not about to just give them up. If what Jotun said was true, even those who did not reach the final floor could gain some guidance. This could be the perfect thing to train his own workers. Or at least give them experience outside of just what the inn could provide. But first, he needed to learn a bit more about the pagoda. How long do you think it will take someone to reach the top floor of the pagoda if it were left open to the public? He asked. That is not easy to estimate. Since I know the value of the pagoda, I'll be sure to send in the best and brightest. But that in itself does not mean anything. The pagoda, which I entered, was so old, no one knew exactly how long it had been there. I suspect these are all relics from a distant past that have yet to achieve their purpose. So basically, no one was likely to reach the top floor anytime soon. Lex wasn't arrogant enough to believe that he could pass all its tests and reach the top, at least not without sufficient preparation. That wouldn't stop him from trying, though. I understand. Your motive of trying to improve the circumstances of your own race are quite pure and worth commending, but the fact remains that the inn is currently having an event targeted to the masses. Tell me, other than the pagoda, what does that realm have? Do you know its size? Lex immediately felt the tension in the room rise back up, which he wanted, but there was also an unwanted reaction. Lex planned on the Emperor trying to bargain or negotiating with the Innkeeper, resulting in him earning a good sum of MP while also keeping a channel open for himself and the inn staff. But instead of trying to negotiate, Lex felt that the three were already gearing up for fail-safe measures they had already planned out. We haven't done a thorough scan of its size, but an early estimate is that the minor realm is between 1 to 2 million acres in size. The terrain is vibrant and supports some local wildlife, though no beasts or cultivators have been discovered so far. All in all, it seems like a nice spot for a vacation, said Lex, with a smile. It would be a shame if I give full access rights to just the Empire, especially during this event. After all, if I do that, I would have to do the same when others make similar requests. I cannot favor certain guests over others. I understand, the Emperor said, assuming he had been rejected. As for negotiating? He had spent a very large amount of time with the Hanali. He understood better than anyone else not to think too highly of himself and assume he could ask for favors when in front of beings of such power. But, I suppose there is something that can be done. After all, I cannot ignore long-time guests either. Lex looked towards Ragnar for a brief moment before continuing. How about this? Since only you have found the realm entrance, and no one else has entered, I'll make it so that this realm is exclusive for humans only. I'll move the entrance to the Immortal Bastion so that it's easier to access. Of course, since I am doing all of this, there is a price. The three were genuinely surprised by the turnaround and then filled with extreme enthusiasm. The price did not matter, they were in a position to pay. In fact, Lex himself knew that he could at this moment extort a few trillion MP for this, and they would not hesitate. But his deep-rooted understanding of the Innkeeper's prestige, as well as his sixth sense, let him know how crass it would seem to exchange a favor in place of some money. So instead, he focused on something that would benefit him, but secretly. I have already stated that I will not interfere with what happens inside the minor realms. Since you have requested this as a heritage site for the human race, and the entrance of the site is through the inn, you will have to provide security for those humans entering for the sake of accessing the pagoda. He knew how powerful the bloodlines for his workers were. If he was going to be sending them to the pagoda, he had to make sure no one tried to harm them secretly to extract their bloodlines or study them. Speaking of which, he suddenly had an idea. Maybe he should find a relatively safer minor realm and try to have the workers colonize it. They weren't lacking in any way, but since they were actual, living people, Lex wanted them to have lives outside of the inn as well. Besides, it would be a good learning opportunity for them. New experiences were an integral part of developing one's personality. The Emperor was taken aback by the kind of price the Innkeeper mentioned, but then again it only made sense. The Innkeeper was an excellent host. He would, of course, be concerned about his guests' welfare. The group started hashing out the details while they each made plans in their heads about how to move forward. Back in the race. Lex was doing well, and he was approaching the end. Gerard was in sight, as well as a few other finalists. But his mood wasn't all that great. He had outdone himself to gain so much ground while pulling those ahead of himself back. His incredible intuition had played an incredible role in helping him avoid almost all power-ups as well. The one he wasn't able to avoid, however. Lex turned to his left and gave the black-hooded Zenmas, who was driving right beside him, the look of death. Unfortunately, with a chicken nest glued directly on top of his head with a mother hen sleeping inside of it, he did not look as intimidating. Above his cart was an entire chicken coop, filled with eggs and live chickens, not only distracting him, but increasing the weight of his cart as well. The moment he found out who designed such an absurd power-up, he would. God only knew, but he would do something. Chapter 532, So Close. Having a chicken coop above his cart served a greater purpose than cosmetic comedy. There was the obvious distraction of having an entire living being glued to his own head. But more than that, the coop completely ruined the aerodynamics of the already less than stellar design of the cart and added some weight to it as well. Although the penalty was not permanent, considering that Lex was not first, and that there was tough competition around him, it exacerbated his situation. Lex winced at his own pun, but quickly diverted his attention back to the matter at hand. Gerard was in the lead, as expected, but he had been slowed down by a plow that was attached to his cart. He too had been a victim of someone's power-up, and likely more than one over the course of the race, or else he would have already finished the race. Other than his own phenomenal driving, there was one very important reason why he was in the lead, as Lex eventually discovered. Unlike Z, who sucked the energy out of Lex's cart after crashing into it, Gerard was doing the same for every cart on the entire track. Moreover, he was somehow getting away with it since he technically wasn't hurting anyone's cart, so it didn't count as an attack. Instead, Lex assumed that he was justifying it as defense by stating that he was simply keeping everyone away from himself. Lex had no actual proof of this, but it was the conclusion he came to when he noticed a few things. First, he had originally used a defensive technique to escape the influence of the artificial gravity, but when he returned to the ground, he noticed that his cart was driving faster all of a sudden. He had not noticed earlier, since the difference had been so minute, but every cart was driving just a bit slower than what it should have been able to. Gerard, with his unmatched skills, was able to turn that slight advantage into a huge lead. Of course, the reason he didn't outright shut all the carts down was because then the other racers would take cautionary measures. If Lex was able to protect himself from Gerard's influence, so would others. Instead, by being discreet, almost no one had noticed. But even if the plan was ingenious, it was the implementation that bewildered Lex. His range was just too ridiculous. He wasn't able to help himself and check the old man's status. Name, Gerard. Age, 1. Sex, male. Cultivation details, foundation mid. Species, human. Bloodline, Regalia Bloom 3. Remarks, an employee with abnormally high affinity for his bloodline. He has already gone through 2 mutations for a remarkably stable bloodline, making him nearly invincible below the immortal realm. Damn! Lex exclaimed mentally. If the system considered him nearly invincible below the immortal realm, his real capabilities must be ridiculously insane. But Lex was not demoralized. He himself was no pushover either, and he wasn't about to quit just because the competition was tough. The chicken as well as the coop finally vanished from atop Lex and his vehicle, and he did not hesitate to use his final power-up. A massive explosion occurred with Lex at the center, not only knocking Zenma's and a few others aside, it also brought up a massive smoke cloud obscuring the path. Lex, of course, was completely fine, and so was his cart due to his incredible defensive techniques. The incredibly tenacious Z was also unharmed, for he simply absorbed the energy from the blast and channeled it to his cart's engine. For a moment it seemed like the showdown was going to be Z, Lex, and then Gerard. Lex had already been through the various parts of the inn, around the new immortal bastion, over the fire temple and many other points of interest. That was after he skipped so much of the track from falling off the ship. By now they were returning to the village, and the stadium where their race had begun was in sight. The track was straightforward with no power-ups in sight. The only chance Lex had was to make the best of the time where Gerard's cart was still slowed down by a plow. Somehow, Lex transitioned from the physically capable yet emotionally volatile berserk state to the flow state. He shut out the world and focused solely on the track, finding the best possible and efficient most path on the track. The cheers of the crowd in the distance disappeared. The sound of the raging wind vanished. The world around him began fading away. There was only him and the track, which also began to vanish. Eh? Lex wasn't getting in the zone. Someone had used an unavoidable power-up on him or someone close to him. He was driving in a sensory deprivation bubble. Basically, as the name suggested, while inside the bubble all his senses would disappear. The bubble would only last for 10 seconds, but would cover a massive area around the targeted cart. Damn it. Lex closed his eyes, or maybe they were already closed. He pulled up his memory of what the track looked like and just drove according to his memory. Fortunately, the path was more or less straight. The only thing he had to be careful of was that he was driving up and down a series of small plateaus. If he just simulated the speed he was going at, and the scenery according to his memory, he would be able to navigate the track correctly. Whoever had made a move should be behind him, and it couldn't have been Z, for he was keeping a track of Z's power-ups. So, either another player was making a last-minute attempt to win this, or Zenma's was getting his revenge. Whoever it was had made a good play, but Lex wasn't out of this yet. Driving on the track out of pure memory, he maintained the most optimal path to overtake Gerard. At the same time, he employed a massive talk to the hand behind his cart. Overtaking him wasn't going to be as easy as the perpetrator thought. Back at the stadium, the crowds were going wild. They had seen the cart, which had snuck up on everyone, and had seen it strike Lex with the sensory deprivation bubble. They could tell that Lex could see or hear nothing. Just as they prepared for Lex to lose control, and the new cart to overtake him, something unexpected happened. Lex continued to drive, making the barest possible changes to his path necessary to stay on track, all with his eyes closed. Moreover, as the new cart came, using its boosters to overtake Lex, it directly crashed into an invisible wall behind Lex. Only, it did not handle it as flawlessly as Z had done so, and became completely disoriented. A good try to contender John, yet another employee of the inn. He used invisibility throughout the race to stay hidden and protect himself, but he himself ended up ramming into an invisible wall, exclaimed the commentator, who had jumped out of his commentary booth by now. He was standing on the roof of the commentary booth, his excitement keeping him from staying still. Despite all that, driver Leo maintains his position and steadily gains on cart number 01, driven by the ever-popular Gerard. With his eyes closed no less. A short while later, when the sensory bubble vanished, Lex opened his eyes and found himself exactly where he imagined he'd be. They had entered the stadium and the finish line was within sight. Gerard was still ahead, without anything dragging him back. Right behind him were Z and John, who were now contending with one another. There wasn't enough time, and Lex had no power-ups. He wouldn't be able to overtake Gerard, at least not normally. He closed his eyes once again and re-entered the berserk state. Time seemed to slow down as he focused all his strength to his legs, or rather, to his right leg. If he used a technique it would be a foul, but he had already confirmed that using his physical capabilities was not an issue. Gerard was 30 feet, 9 meters, away from the finish line. As fast as he possibly could, Lex jumped out of the cart and landed on his right foot. The crowd seemed to realize something was about to happen. Lex let out a deep, angry yell and he pushed all the strength in his body through his single leg. The track cracked right under his foot and slowly began to form into a crater, but even as it was forming Lex had already vanished. Like a bazooka Lex shot forward, suddenly overtaking the ever-leading Gerard. Everything happened too fast. The commentator did not even have a chance to scream, let alone the bewildered crowd. Exhilaration flooded Lex's veins as he saw the finish line. It was right in front of him. He could practically feel the ribbon hitting his body as he crossed. But the feeling was overshadowed by a warning. Something was coming. But everything was happening too fast. By the time Lex felt the warning it was already too late, and a string connected itself to him, leading back to Gerard. A power-up. But it was too late. The next second he and Gerard had swapped places. He was behind and Gerard was at the finish line. Damn it, he had been saving his power-ups. The next moment, instead of the siren of victory, the sound of a loud crash filled the stadium. Although Lex and Gerard had swapped places, Lex left his talk to the hand right behind the finish line. Even if the skilled driver was capable of overcoming it using his bloodline, he would have to anticipate it first. The swap between them had been too quick, and they had been moving too fast for the racer to realize it was there. The next moment, Lex crossed the finish line, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Chapter 533, The Big Devil. The crowds went wild at Lex's victory, even if most of them didn't actually understand what actually happened. In the last couple of seconds, the exchange between Lex and Gerard has been too difficult for most of the crowds to follow, but that didn't deprive them of feeling the intensity of the moment. Moreover, as soon as Lex won, the various screens changed from following other racers and all either focused on Lex, or began to play a slowed-down replay of the final moments. The number of tricks involved made for a truly remarkable spectacle. From the get-go, Lex's speed boost using his physical body was not only unexpected, it was staggering to behold. Even if he were a body cultivator, getting that kind of acceleration was far out of the ordinary. In fact, had Lex been purely cultivating the regal embrace, it would have never happened. But his body had undergone too many upgrades. His body was sturdy enough to tolerate the ridiculous burst of power his many upgrades gave to him. Anyone else would have been reduced to destroying their own bodies every time they exhibited their strength. The fact that he could easily switch his states also helped tremendously. In the last moment he had entered the berserk state, which heavily boosted his physical prowess beyond what he could normally output. In exchange for all that destructive power, all Lex felt was slightly exhausted and a bit of soreness in his leg. It couldn't be helped, his body's defense just made him too durable. The quick wit displayed by both Gerard and Lex after Lex made his final move just made for too exciting a finish. The crowds had long entered into a standing ovation, though neither Lex nor Gerard seemed to have noticed. Lex himself was basking in the exhilaration of the victory. Lately, any kind of excitement in his life had to do with putting his life on the line. It was great to finally be able to have something non-lethal get his adrenaline pumping. He truly only cared about the challenge the race had provided. The first place obviously got a number of awards and accolades, such as a trophy, some MP, some other free vouchers for certain services at the inn. But none of that really mattered to him. The race had been a nice break from all the work he had been doing, and he knew that he wouldn't have time for anything like this again soon. Even as his cart came to a stop and he finally began to notice the cheering crowds, most of his attention had already been diverted back to his office. The innkeeper, the emperor, his wife and the general had spent some time discussing plans for the minor realm. The innkeeper had stated that the empire should be in charge of safety inside the minor realm, which was no problem at all for the massive empire, excluding a single hiccup. Although the pagoda offered excellent benefits to those that traversed its levels, it had one caveat: the tests each floor presented could absolutely be lethal. The only way to exit the pagoda was at the entrance to each floor. Once a participant entered a new floor, they could choose to exit via a teleportation formation, or continue forward. Continuing on didn't mean they couldn't come back, but from what the emperor recalled, deaths inside the pagoda were all too common. Besides any deaths inside the pagoda, the emperor promised the strictest of securities, due to how seriously they treated the pagoda. He even elaborated on the kind of deployment the emperor planned, during which Lex learned a new term, heaven immortal. Although no one explained to him, Lex concluded that it was the level directly or soon after Earth immortal. The reason it was brought up was because the emperor planned on having at least one person of such a cultivation realm present inside the minor realm at all times. Based on how the general and the empress reacted, cultivators in this realm were considered sufficiently powerful. It was good to know, but it did not matter to Lex at the moment. Instead, he took this opportunity to inform the emperor about the inheritance lounge as well. The reason why it was not popular, and almost no one knew of it, was because it required a level 4 midnight in prestige to use. Since he was looking to strengthen the human race, that would also be a good way. Incidentally, Lex would also earn some MP along the way, but that was beside the point. The emperor was intrigued and immediately began planning to investigate it, while Lex silently started planning a couple of things of his own. It was just too convenient. For a time, he thought that the problems faced by Earth were beyond him, and he more or less accepted it. He had detached himself from the planet, and only kept abreast of its situation due to his nostalgic feelings. He also felt a certain level of indignation, knowing that the Earth and all its peoples had been treated as pawns in a game by some prisoners. He had planned on using the Empire to take control of Earth from whoever was controlling it at the moment, for at least what he had seen of the Empire so far was pretty good. Until it was revealed to him that the Earth was already, in some manner, under the purview of the Empire. Too much of the conversation that happened inside the Chamber of Secrets had been wiped from his memory, but none of that mattered now. He had direct access to the actual ruler of the Empire, so he was sure he could somehow use that to his benefit and allow circumstances on Earth to improve. But at the same time, he as the innkeeper, couldn't randomly bring up Earth. But the pieces were falling perfectly into place for him, as if he was destined to help Earth all along. Marlowe had lost his patience, and was about to make a move against the prisoners who had been manipulating the Earth, the repercussions be damned. Larry was actually planning on joining him, and had even invited Lex. But the way Lex saw it, him joining the attack did not contribute in a meaningful way. Instead, by strengthening his relationship with the Empire directly, he could then casually mention the issue to the Emperor or General using his alternate identity. Although it wouldn't be the same as the Innkeeper mentioning it, due to the increasingly close ties the Inn had with the Empire, he couldn't see them turning him down. Yes, this was a much more practical and viable solution. At the same time, it was also slowly strengthening the Inn. It was a win-win in his book. Once the Emperor left, Lex began planning his next actions. He had to keep an eye out for a minor realm suitable for the Inn workers only. He also had to go explore the dangers of the pagoda himself. Once he got a good sense of how dangerous it was, he could plan how to start sending his workers to the pagoda. He also had to remember to look over the next phase of the festival going on. Now that the Grand Prix had come to a conclusion, the next big event was supposed to begin. Although the races would now become a staple of the Inn, he wouldn't be focusing all his resources on promoting just that. Although, in Lex's mind, the next event wasn't too exciting, it had potential. There was a knock on his office door, interrupting his flow of thoughts. That was strange. "Come in," said Lex. Luther opened the door and said, "Innkeeper, there's a guest here who wishes to meet with you. If you'd like, I can schedule a meeting for later, or turn him away." It felt strange that Luther was informing him of this, as usually Mary was one who would pop up and let him know of these things, but then again, Luther was his secretary. It only made sense that if anyone approached the office, Luther would be the one they'd interact with. "Sure, send them in," Lex said as he cleared his thoughts. While his planning was important, anyone who could bear the pressure of his office and ask to meet him would be worth giving his attention to. Perhaps deterring the undetermined was also one of the reasons the hall right outside his office radiated such an intimidating aura. A person dressed in a long, brown trench coat walked in, a small black notepad in his hand. The coat hid his entire body, and the fedora he was wearing hid his face well. Lex felt like he was in front of a detective from a black and white movie. Until, that is, he scanned the person. The guest was a devil and, coincidentally, his name was one that was all too famous on Earth. Name, Rocketfellow Rothsfather. Chapter 534 Business. Zagan stumbled through the door once again, his humanoid body battered and bruised, much worse than ever before. It never occurred to him how strange it was for a monster born of darkness to take on a human form. It was as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Though he was in bad condition, his concern extended to none of that. His eyes wandered the familiar room in search of something, and when he saw the resplendent Alicia, disappointment welled up in his chest, though maybe deep down, he was also happy. "Why are you still here?" he asked as he tried to wipe the blood off his face. "You should have left long ago." The moment he finished his words, a door appeared behind Alicia as if signaling a way out. Yet she did not hesitate to once again pick up her med kit and approach the bleeding humanoid monster. "Why do you keep going back?" she asked, instead of answering his question. "Every time you go through that door you only come back worse for wear. What are you looking for?" She moved his hair from his forehead to see a massive cut, bleeding into his eyes. With a sigh she got to work, washing all his wounds. By now she knew he was not so delicate that he would die from these wounds, so she always prioritized cleaning them first so she would have a good understanding of his actual condition. "I don't know," Zagan whispered as he closed his eyes. A moment later, he felt the cold water she poured over his face. "I guess I'm searching for something that will provide me with meaning." As a monster born from darkness, he was not actually afraid of light, but the more time he spent in darkness, the stronger he would go. Monsters from the crystal realm were born with limited intelligence, so they compensated for it by having extremely strong instincts that would guide their actions. Zagan had lived for millions of years, and so had grown to the level where he achieved self-awareness and a decent amount of intelligence, yet he continued to act in accordance with his instincts. Yet over time, he began to wonder why it was he listened to his instincts. What was it they were leading him towards? Was there something more? Was there a point to being alive? These questions did not elicit any strong emotions from the monster, as it did not quite have the emotional range of naturally born animals. Still, with time, a subtle curiosity had taken hold of his mind. Lately, his curiosity was being tingled by Alicia. Why would she always treat him? He knew she was alone during the time he left, and unlike him, she did not like being alone. Still, she never left. Why? Unlike Zagan, Alicia's thought process was a lot simpler. Though she happened to have forgotten her life, the feeling of loneliness and abandonment stayed with her. There was no one around to help her when she needed it, for a very long time. So if someone else needed her help, she would not abandon them. It was that simple. Unknown to both of them, their each and every action was being judged and measured. Zagan had actually been failing his test miserably, mostly because he did not understand what was required of him. That all changed when he interacted with Alicia. The parameters of his test changed, and while he was failing the test for his original role, he seemed to be acing the test for his new one. Soon, both their tests would come to an end. Lex scanned the devil and read the results. Name, Rocketfellow Rossfather. Age, 44, fake. Sex, male. Cultivation details, golden core early, fake. Species, devil. Midnight and prestige level, 1. Remarks, don't let appearances fool you, this devil is rich. His trenchcoat alone is worth several MTs. There were a few interesting things to note in the status, the name of the devil being only 1. The name was so popular and influential, he doubted there were barely a few working adults on the planet who had never heard the name. Though not everyone understood the full gravity behind the name, it was enough to understand that they were incredibly rich. In fact, in one of the files filled with rumors that Velma had given him revealed that the patriarch of both those families were also actually political prisoners being held on the planet. But compared to those who were instigating wars and conflicts for entertainment purposes, those two seemed pretty tame. The second thing that interested Lex was the man's name and cultivation. They had a fake written in front of them, which is something Lex had never seen before. When he focused on the word, more information was revealed stating that the man's actual details were being hidden by the trenchcoat he was wearing. The system could detect the interference, but could not overcome it. Just that on its own was a great testament to the man's background and depth. Lex did not treat him lightly at all. I hope you were not waiting for too long, said Lex with his usual warm tone. Regardless of the man's background or depth, the innkeeper would not be fazed by it. The fault is my own for showing up unannounced, Rocketfellow said with a fairly warm tone of his own. Much of his face remained hidden behind his trenchcoat, so Lex could not see his expression, but his tone at least was earnest and calm. Moreover, using his sixth sense, Lex could tell the devil had reacted normally to his statement. Please, Mr. Innkeeper, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Rocketfellow Rossfather, and I am a businessman. I absolutely fell in love with your Midnight Inn when I first saw it, and wanted to form a joint venture with you immediately. But, for the first time in my life, my scope was too small to match up to your establishment. Although I am still working on that, and have a few plans, for now, there is one other business idea I would like to talk to you about. The Midnight Inn is open to all guests, and so naturally, is also open to your business as well. Please, tell me, how can I help you? The extremely formal devil opened the small black notebook in his hand and showed Lex a list of names. Immediately he picked up on a few familiar ones, Leo, Gerard, Z, Luther. At first, he thought the list was based around the inn workers, but then he began to see other names, belonging to the various guests. He was confused and he was unable to pick out any significant detail connecting all the people, except for the fact that they were all male. Instead of making an unfounded guess, Lex remained silent and waited for the devil to elaborate, which he soon did. "I'm sure you're able to see what connects all these names," the devil said with a hint of excitement. "At first, when I realized the potential, I thought it was too good to be true. I waited patiently to be proved wrong, but when nothing happened, I had to pinch myself. I've hardly ever seen anyone miss out on such an obvious business opportunity like this. Mr. Innkeeper, after I watched the Lady Cosmos fashion show, I was awaiting the arrival of the Mr. Cosmos show, but it never came. Obviously whoever had the idea first never thought to extend the show to the other gender, but I think it's a huge waste. Obviously I can't reuse the same name as I want to build my own brand, and I want to do things a little differently as well. Instead of UST beauty, I want to focus on strength and cultivation as well. After all, men are looked at differently than women. But there's so much more than that. Mr. Innkeeper, I know that if I simply want to host my own competition it should not be a problem, but what if I want to partner with the inn itself? Or, if that's not on the table, how can I get some of the inn's workers to participate in my event? I've never seen anyone with a fan club as dedicated as Gerard, and I don't know if you know this, but the recent performance of Leo has managed to grow his popularity quite a bit as well. Now just imagine, after we work out the kinks, your workers' faces are known across the universe, not only because of the inn, but because they finally get the recognition their good looks deserve." This was not what Lex had been expecting from this meeting. Let alone his own Leo persona, he didn't want to let any of his workers near this weird trench coat creep. Has he been stalking them? I'm thinking, since the first show will be a test run to figure out how to run the competition, of keeping a small budget of 5 MTs. What do you think? Mr. Rothsfather, the Midnight Inn is exactly the best place to launch your endeavor. I want to congratulate you in advance for a successful venture. Chapter 535 Burden. Alexander Morrison was waiting for his next deployment, still at the Midnight Inn. After immense effort on his part, he had proved himself worthy of undergoing special training by the Empire. Due to his unique situation, regardless of what he did, it was more or less assumed that Alexander would never have full loyalty to the Empire. As such, he could not get in touch with their unique or specialized training, reserved for their most trusted elites, but he had managed to improve his situation nonetheless. To test out his new capabilities, he sparred a few times with his family's strongest. In an upfront fight, he still could not defeat his grandfather, but the old man admitted that Alexander put a lot of pressure on him. Of course, that could not be a true test, for both Alexander and his grandfather were holding back immensely as well. Alexander knew that if he were going for the kill, he would have behaved differently. Still, being unable to overwhelm his grandfather disappointed him somewhat. He had learned much of the Empire, and learned about noble families. While it could not be claimed that such feats were common, it was at least not unheard of for the scions of noble families to be able to completely overwhelm even those at higher realms. A part of him wondered how far he was from their level. He even pondered what the difference was between himself and his old teacher Marlowe when he was at the Golden Core realm. A part of him told him that he would lose a spar, but in a fight to the death anything was possible. Instead of being proud of his achievements, he felt frustrated that even after everything he went through, he was still only on par with the peak of those from his home planet. Then again, he had not been cultivating for very long. Speaking of which, had his birthday passed? He couldn't remember. The Empire obviously followed their own calendar system, and he never really put any real effort into remembering it. He'd never really paid attention to any of his birthdays, except his 15th for obvious reasons. It was always Helen who. Captain Alexander, a soldier called out, breaking him free from his reverie. On instinct, he stood to attention as he saw a small group of soldiers walking towards him, holding what looked like a backpack. His eyes shone. That was. "You have new orders, Captain," the soldier said, as he presented Alexander with a tablet. Familiar with what was happening, Alexander put his hand on the tablet as it verified his identity. The Empire's technology was heads and tails ahead of Earth, so even though the device looked similar to stuff available on Earth, its actual functionality was far beyond anything he had ever seen. It was a spirit tech device that verified Alexander's identity using things such as his fingerprint, DNA, spirit energy signature, the specific meridian patterns in his hand, and many other things he had no idea about. Once his identity was confirmed, though, the soldier passed him the backpack and began briefing him on his new orders. The specific details are on a need-to-know basis, but essentially high-level Empire officials have entered into a partnership with the Midnight Inn to take control of a specific minor realm. Your new orders. Across the inn, countless other Empire officials were receiving similar orders. As of now, very select few were being informed about the minor realm and exactly how much importance the Emperor put on it. The seemingly laid-back Emperor had decided that he had spent enough time away from his empire. Once his latest mission for the Henali was over, he would return to do some house cleaning. Unlike Ragnar, who was more lenient of humans, the Emperor was not so clement in his treatment. The reason why the Empire was so strong, and had never suffered from any rebellions, was because basically anyone with any rebellious tendencies was dead. He did not expect others to be grateful for all that he worked for, but if they thought to take advantage of him, they had another thing coming. Mr. Rothsfather, for the last time, although I can give your business my full support, I cannot force anyone to participate. Besides, my workers have their own duties to take care of. Innkeeper, you have to understand, the influence of celebrities is massive for events like these. While we can obviously hire or attract external celebrities for the event, if we leverage the growing fanbase of local stars such as Gerard, Leo, or Z, not only will we have an easier time gaining a loyal fanbase, it will even benefit your own inn. Lex smiled. For the past 15 minutes, they had been going over the same argument. No matter how much sense he made, he was destined to win because as Leo, he was never going to participate in a fashion show. As entertaining as it sounded, he had better things to do. Ultimately, the devil relented and promised that he would soon return with a full plan for everything he had planned for the event. Then he would work with the inn to see how much of his vision could be accomplished. After the meeting, the devil exited the office, and then disappeared from the inn. He appeared in a room where a few devils were waiting for his return. So? How was it? Plan for bringing the inn's workforce away from the inn has failed. I'll continue with the show regardless as it can benefit many of our other plans. In the meantime, begin Plan B. The Midnight Inn employees are the perfect canvas to turn into demons, we have to get our hands on them. I told you it was too easy, replied one of the people in the room. Regardless, it was worth a try. Here's a list of our primary targets. Other than the inn's employees, begin tracking their location. Once the meeting with the devil was over, Lex spent some time planning out his next few actions. Since the Grand Prix was over, it was time to get ready for the next event which would start tomorrow. He still did not know what to think of this event, for compared to the exciting amusement parks and races, it was a far cry. But it was good to shake things up. One of the features the inn unlocked, but almost no one paid attention to, was the fishing well. The well was connected to worlds that the inn was linked to, though the interrealm broadcast spread that to the entire realms that the inn was connected to. Through the well, guests could fish for unowned items. Basically, any item within the domain that was connected to the inn, and which had no owner, could be fished for through the fishing well. Of course, what item a person fished up was completely random and based on luck. So you could get something simple and mundane, such as a random rock or a seashell. Or, you could get a phenomenal treasure that could change your life around. It sounded amusing, but at the same time, it sounded like a scam. That, alongside the fact that Lex had priced each fishing attempt at 5,000 MP per attempt, led to the fact that no one had ever tried to fish at all. He figured this unusual feature required some marketing, so the next event would be a fishing attempt. Participants could fish for free, and whoever pulled up the best reward could move forward in the rounds. Each round would eliminate half the participants, or as near to half as possible, until there would be one winner. How successful or exciting the event would be was, well, it left a lot of room for speculation. Still, it wasn't as it hurt to try. On the off chance that one of the participants pulled out something spectacular, the attention due to the event would raise the well's popularity. If not, then it could be a prop that Lex could use to look like he was wise and enlightened by fishing in it, like the teachers in kung fu movies. While he was making preparations for the event, the inn was still celebrating the end of the race. Although Gerard had ultimately lost, he took his defeat gracefully. Strangely though, his defeat did not negatively affect his popularity at all. If anything, his popularity shot through the roof. The fan club, which had originally started out as a group of grandmas who liked to be driven around by Gerard, now had tens of thousands of legitimate fans, and with each moment, that number seemed to be growing. In fact, Leo, the actual winner of the race, seemed to have been forgotten to the side while the crowd tossed the old man in the air and cheered for him. As for Gerard himself, he was lamenting the negative side effects of his bloodline. Although he became more powerful every time his bloodline evolved, a negative side effect of his bloodline was that it would make him increasingly beautiful as it grew stronger, without taking away from his masculinity. The worker sighed in his heart as he could not let the guests see him lament. Beauty was such a burden. Chapter 536 Prelude. Lex felt pretty good about how things were going in general, especially after the race. He reminded himself to let off a little steam now and again. There was nothing about the innkeeper that said he had to stay serious all the time. As much as he had to overview everything and make sure everything was running smoothly, he should also enjoy the inn's amenities himself. Though, he couldn't say that he was disappointed that Gerard was, as it was called, suffering from success rather than him. Even from a distance he could see him being thrown up and down in the air by the crowd. Lex had heard things about crowd surfing that he'd rather not experience himself. Better Gerard than him. He turned his attention towards the next event. He did not think a stadium was a fitting venue for the fishing tournament, so he had to pick another spot. He teleported to a small lake near the village and found the place to be suitable. The area was filled with small hills with gentle slopes and a few scattered yet large trees. He moved the well to a clearing at the base of a hill and placed wooden benches all around. He formed stalls that would sell food and placed a few grills nearby. The workers would man some of the grills, but some would be left in case the guests felt like cooking on their own. Single, wooden swings were attached to the branches of the trees. Bonfire pits were created and a few, fixed huts, were placed here and there. He couldn't consult the turtle as it was still occupied, so after talking to the gardener, Lex placed various bushes in the area that grew edible berries and fruits. Compared to the festive and exciting events such as the Grand Prix or the amusement park, this event felt much more calm and homely. Lex wanted to turn this place into a permanent camping spot. He even placed a few fishing boats in the lake in case anyone felt the itch after watching the tournament. He told the planning division to take care of any last-minute touches the place needed, but should stay in keeping with the theme of camping. He spent the next few hours taking care of a few miscellaneous issues relating to the inn, such as a few other guests who wanted to meet him, approve the latest worker rotations for the immortal bastion and set prices for the new food being grown from the new desert farm. For one of the tasks, he called Luther to his office. "You called, Innkeeper?" he asked as he stepped in. To his great disappointment, the innkeeper did not give him as many tasks as he hoped. It was only once in a while that the innkeeper assigned him a task. He thought it might be because of his previous failure, where he proposed plans that the innkeeper didn't like. He was determined to change. "I'm sure you're aware of the event going on related to minor realms at the inn," the innkeeper said, looking up from his work. "I've tasked a few workers to compile a detailed list of all the realms discovered and their conditions. I want you to go over that list and find a realm suitable for the workers. I plan on having all the inn's employees colonize that realm." You're sending us away?" he asked, alarmed. No, that's not what I mean," the innkeeper said, chuckling when he realized how Luther had perceived it. "Right now, the only thing most of the workers know is the Midnight Inn. While that is not a bad thing, if they never experience normal life, or what the rest of the universe is like, their growth will be completely stunted. They will lack an understanding of common experiences, which will not only taint their worldview, it will keep them from understanding the guests' perspectives. If they lack such perspective, how can they better serve the guests? Realization dawned on Luther. This was not a punishment, but a reward as well as a test. The innkeeper was trusting them with more responsibility to see how they performed. On one hand, it provided them a peek into life outside the inn, while on the other hand it tested their survival skills without the handholding of the innkeeper. In truth, Lex just felt bad. He treated the Midnight Inn like his home, so the workers naturally took the place of his family. As great as the inn was, if they were never allowed to leave, then what would be the difference between this and a prison? But at the same time, he did not want to send them to other worlds yet. They were too weak. Speaking of weakness, Lex had been stuck in a unique conundrum of late. Although he had given Jotun his response to the Hinali's requests, he did not know how they would react. While he could not give up his strong front, he also could not afford to cross them. He had not forgotten how simply entering their conference room, of sorts, was enough to put Lex into a coma. Lately he had begun thinking of returning to the Crystal Realm to complete his quest. If he could have the Midnight Inn exit the Origin Realm, he would not be beholden to the Hinali any longer. But he decided to wait till they gave their response before making any judgments. He had spent a long time in the Crystal Realm, and he did not feel eager to return. Besides, the inn was flourishing now that he could give it all his attention. "I'll get it done," said Luther, with conviction. "Do you have any special requirements in mind?" "Pick a suitable place, that's all. While I'll give you a starting budget for your colonization, after that everyone will have to rely on harvesting local resources to cater to your needs. You can take a poll to see what kind of environment everyone would like." "It will be done," he said with vigor, before excusing himself. With that out of the way, Lex was momentarily done with all tasks that urgently required his attention. There was always more work to be done, but nothing that he needed to take care of at that exact moment. So he turned his attention to personal matters. Using his personal hologram, he sent Larry a message. "Larry, there's been a change of plans. I won't be joining you and Marlowe, but I've found a way we can avoid any negative repercussions of attacking those prisoners. Thoroughly document everything they've done, or as much as you can, and try to get a confession from them if possible. Make a good case for why Earth, even as a part of the Empire, has been severely neglected and its people have been left to suffer. Once you're done, give me everything you've gathered. If things go according to plan, not only will we avoid any fallout, the situation on Earth will drastically improve." After sending the message, Lex couldn't help but sigh. His connection to the Empire will greatly benefit his home planet, even if he had decided to leave it behind. It seemed like he had a magic touch. Everything just got better under his influence. Lex chuckled. Such thoughts were too self-absorbed, even for him. In truth, he was a man in an extremely precarious situation, putting on an excellent balancing act. With that done, and everything else being handled well enough by the system, Lex couldn't help but turn his attention towards the new minor realm that had been given to the Empire. He was a little curious about this pagoda. If he wanted it to serve as a training ground for his workers, he first needed to get a deeper understanding of its difficulty. After a quick scan that showed that William was still at the manor, Lex decided to pay the pagoda a visit. He was curious to see how difficult these trials really were. He did not at all harbor any thoughts that he might complete all the trials in a single go, thereby gaining an incredible heritage that put him on the same level as the Emperor. It was not like he had begun to suffer from an MC complex. Yes, he was totally just going to scope it out. He teleported to his room to change, but then realized he hadn't really gotten any new gear to suit his new realm. With a shrug, he changed into jeans and a t-shirt, and teleported to the Immortal Bastion. "Mary, I'm going to be a little busy for a while, so if anyone has a tribulation similar to the one Ragnar had, warn me well in advance so I can set enough formations." He really could not think of anything else going wrong while he was away. He had taken precautions against everything he could think of, and had enough guards to protect the inn in case other troublemakers arrived. Besides, he would only be gone for a short time. What's the worst that could happen? Shortly after Lex entered the minor realm, Adrift, who had spent an extended amount of time at the inn, finally returned to Earth. Not everyone was a multi-billionaire. As much as he wanted to continue to party at the inn, he couldn't afford it. Chapter 537, Not Building Suspense. For a long time now, Larry had been living at the Midnight Inn. Using the guild room to make some money made it very easy for him to stay there indefinitely, and the conveniences it offered made it the preferable choice, not to mention the perpetual safety from assassinations it offered. It also allowed him to get his hands on resources and gear that he'd never be able to find on Earth. He'd rented a courtyard where he mostly lived by himself, though his girlfriend spent a lot of time there as well. The most convenient thing about having his own place at the inn, though, was that he could build his setup as he desired, without fear of someone breaking in and getting their hands on his stuff. Dozens of screens were attached to walls in the room he was in, completely isolated from the noise of the many servers he had stacked in the next room. The phenomenal temperature control at the inn kept the servers running at optimal speeds without ever heating up. Though at the moment, his machines weren't doing anything processor heavy. Various videos played on the different screens, all of them muted. They depicted the various defenses around the place they were about to venture into. Larry kept his gaze fixed on one massive temple, even as his attention was diverted towards Lex's message. So basically, he didn't need to worry about getting in trouble as long as he collected plenty of evidence. He didn't show much of a reaction on his face as he put on his gear. He was not disappointed because of Lex's absence in the mission. No, his only thought was on the mission ahead of him. Today, he would finally face the man responsible for everything that happened to him. He teleported out of the inn. Alexander resisted the urge to groan. Although he could not say the challenge he faced was completely inconceivable, it definitely wasn't what he had expected when he heard of the pagoda. His body was still getting used to the incredibly heavy gravity in the room. It was not just a matter of warming up his muscles or activating his spirit energy. Every single function in his body had come under an additional stress that it had to fight against. His spirit energy felt heavier as he channeled it, slowing down all his techniques. His blood was pulled away from his brain and towards his legs, forcing his body to put in extra work just to keep that from happening. The air itself felt heavy in his lungs, making it difficult for the oxygen to diffuse into his blood without hurting his lungs themselves. All of that was happening simultaneously and continuously. He did not know how much stronger the gravity was. His brain was not some kind of machine that could accurately calculate that the gravity was X times heavier than normal, causing him to expend Y% more energy. All he knew was, his defensive armor came with a cup that was crushing him. After taking a moment to adjust himself, he felt much more comfortable. Or at least, as comfortable as he could be given the situation. He stood at the very entrance of the pagoda, and in front of him was a line etched into the ground. Once he crossed the line, his first trial would officially begin. Picked a bad time to start, but, oh well. He used a special technique, activating his backpack, causing it to change form. It began wrapping itself around him, not forming an armor, but a skeletal frame. When it was complete, it revealed itself to be an exosuit. Not only did the suit complement all of his physical capabilities exponentially, it was the first step in mastering some of the strongest weapons the Empire had to offer. As he stepped forward, Alexander's eyes carried none of the hesitation or confusion he had been feeling the past few days. While there was a part of him that felt things he could not understand, there was also an overwhelming part of him that craved the challenge before him. He would become the best, slowly but steadily. He took a step forward. Lex had moved the entrance to the minor realm he took to calling the pagoda realm out of sheer convenience to the immortal bastion. He expected it to be devoid of any crowds since the bastion was not so popular yet, and the Empire had only just gotten its hands on the realm. He was sorely mistaken. A neat and orderly line of soldiers moved through the realm entrance, completely unprompted by anyone. He attributed it to the discipline of the army, and got in line himself. A young man dressed casually, he stood out from the crowd of armored soldiers, though no one paid too much attention to him. When it was finally Lex's turn and he entered the realm, he was stunned. Already having experienced teleportation, besides the one caused by the golden keys, he was ready for the uneasy feeling. What he was not ready for, however, was the extremely well-developed alley he would come out to. It had only been a few hours since he told Jotun that they would take control of the realm, so he did not really expect any real results. At most he expected the Empire would mobilize some forces and occupy the realm, before slowly developing certain parts of it. After all, not everyone had access to a magical system that would spawn buildings out of thin air. He did not account for the fact that in place of that, the Empire had massive, extremely sophisticated 3D printers that were literally building a fort around Lex, before his very eyes. Someone bumped into him, waking him from his reverie and reminding him to step out of the way of the entrance. After apologizing, Lex moved to the side so he could actually admire the work the Empire was doing. Around the entrance to the realm, which had taken the shape of a door frame filled with white light through which people came, the Empire had built a simple yet elegant patio. He expected they would change that in the future, but for now, it made for a beautiful entrance and exit to the realm. He expected that the entrance had originally been placed in the wild, but it did not look that way right now. A tiled road had already been built in front of the entrance, going straight. He expected that it would eventually lead to a gate, or perhaps a security check through which everyone would pass. For now, it ended near a wall that was being built at the very moment, forming the periphery for a massive, rectangular fort. There were a few ships flying around in the air above him, perhaps scanning and surveying the area. What Lex didn't understand was, when and how these machines got here. Lex had not seen them at the inn, which meant that the Empire probably brought parts and constructed them right here in the realm. The soldiers who were entering the realm were all reporting to various stations, from where they were being sent in every direction. He could imagine that in only a few days, this place would undergo a complete makeover. But regardless of how amazing the technology of the Empire seemed, and how amazing the end result was, it lacked the finish that the inn gave. But it was not like he was accusing them of being lacking. They were already incredible enough by coming close. Lex stepped forward and asked someone for directions to the pagoda, for he couldn't exactly see it anywhere on the horizon. The soldier informed him that it was actually not that close to the entrance and offered him a spot in one of the ships flying around in the air. He promptly agreed and soon found himself climbing aboard the sleek aircraft called Slingshot alongside a few other soldiers heading in the same direction. Why is it called Slingshot? Lex asked the soldier sitting next to him, confused. The design did not really look anything like one. The man only chuckled. But Lex did not need to hear his response, as he immediately understood when the ship rose vertically into the air till it was high enough, then suddenly shot into the distance like a slingshot. He went from 0 to a 100 real quick, and then a 1000, and then probably beyond. Fortunately, the aptly named ship did not stop as abruptly as it launched, and began slowing down only a few minutes later as it ventured into a valley. A very regal and majestic-looking pagoda stood in the heart of the valley, surrounded by what seemed like an ocean of white crystals. Lex's intuition, which had so far been silent, began acting up again. There was something in the pagoda that was extremely valuable, though that was not a surprise. Lex only took a moment to appreciate the beauty around him once he disembarked. But he was generally an impatient man, and not one for building suspense. He stepped in. Chapter 538, Stupid Clichés. "Hey, do you know who that was?" asked one of the soldiers who saw Lex walk into the pagoda. They had been informed that the pagoda would be open to the public, so they didn't really bother to stop him. But it was only after Lex entered that it occurred to one of the soldiers that they hadn't really spread news of the pagoda yet. Although they did have a marketing plan, it had yet to be implemented, so a lot of people should not have known about it yet. The soldiers who had originally encountered the pagoda were told not to spread the news until a deal was made with the innkeeper. Though that order had now been lifted, too little time had passed for the news to propagate properly. "Does it matter?" asked another soldier, who was too preoccupied with his own assignment. The first soldier shrugged and continued with his work. Entering the pagoda did not feel like teleporting at all, though his intuition clearly told him he was in an entirely new area. It felt as if he just walked into another room. The air was surprisingly fresh, though the area looked like a massive hall made from large stone blocks with no windows for ventilation. Closed glass lanterns were attached to the walls, illuminating the hall with dim yellow light. But the range of his sight seemed to be limited, for he couldn't see the end of the hall as it seemed to fade into darkness. Lex drew a parallel between his situation and the visibility of video game characters when they roamed the map. Only a certain area around them would be visible to the player, while the rest of the map would be a mystery. He looked down and saw a thin yet prominent line drawn in the ground. Somehow, without the need to be informed, he knew that his trial would begin the moment he crossed the line. It suddenly occurred to him that he should have polished up on new techniques before entering the pagoda, but then he shrugged. Despite his train of thought earlier, he didn't genuinely believe that he'd be able to complete the pagoda on his first try, regardless of how powerful he was. That was because the limitation sustained by the pagoda for entry was one of age, not the cultivation realm. He was sure there were others out there much stronger than him at his age, so outright firepower shouldn't be the defining factor that allowed one to reach the top of the pagoda. But then again, maybe it was. He still didn't think it would be so straightforward, however. There was only one way to find out. He took a step forward and crossed the line before continuing to walk ahead. Nothing seemed to have happened, but his intuition told him otherwise. The air had been filled with some kind of sedative, though Lex did not bother trying to filter his air. Not only was he confident in his own body's capabilities, but his intuition let him know that it was unable to affect him at all. As he continued to walk forward, more and more gases were mixed into the air, all with various effects. He figured that anyone with a weaker physique would suffer greatly, and even if they decided to hold their breath, it would only last until they faced some action. But there were too many ways to filter the air, so this was still not impressive enough. But all of that changed when he saw a single figure emerge from the darkness up ahead. Lex's face paled as he saw the figure and identified what, or rather, who it was. It was himself. The first trial in the pagoda was to face an exact copy of himself. Lex did not need to draw assumptions, as the pagoda somehow directly planted the information inside his mind, the way it had done about the line in the ground. The evil Lex, as he decided to call him, was completely identical to him in every calculable measure. That meant, much like himself, evil Lex would have an outstanding intuition that would warn him about any incoming attacks, any plans hero Lex made, how to avoid them and how to take advantage of them. He had all his techniques, which fortunately he did not update, and all his gear, which consisted of nothing but his clothes. He also had hero Lex's boundless shamelessness, and would not feel any hesitation in defining himself as the hero and the other as evil. As if that was not enough. "You know, we suck at attacking and are incredibly strong at defense. Why don't we have a chat instead?" said evil Lex, with his signature evil and malevolent smile, which in no way was a result of hero Lex projecting his hate onto him. Hero Lex did not need to reply, because he knew evil Lex had his sixth sense as well, and could determine hero Lex's mental state just by talking. Hero Lex took a deep breath and said, "Let's get this over with." He used "Home Sweet Home" to throw himself at the evil Lex and punched him right in the face. True to his completely arrogant nature, evil Lex did not even bother moving and allowed the punch to land, confident in the knowledge that it could not harm him. As predicted, the punch was unable to harm him, but if things were so simple, evil Lex's expression would not have suddenly changed. Yet it was too late. The ridiculously severe flaw in this unnecessarily common cliché, that Lex felt often ruined anime finales, was that as the original, no one was more familiar with his own weaknesses than Lex himself. The biggest weakness Lex had was his over-reliance on his intuition, and the biggest flaw his intuition suffered was that it was unable to warn of things related to systems. In the last moment before Lex's punch connected, a golden key appeared between his fingers. The key naturally was not able to break through evil Lex's skin, and instead broke itself due to the strength of the clash. Evil Lex disappeared and hero Lex remained, feeling like he had overcome the most ridiculous and overused challenge. If what the pagoda had in store for him was more of this, he would be seriously disappointed. Though, just to make sure he had Mary check if an evil Lex showed up to the inn. He didn't. It seemed the moment the clone or projection or whatever it was exited the pagoda, it ceased to exist. With a snort Lex continued forward. A staircase leading to the next floor revealed itself from the darkness, allowing him to go to the next floor. Larry sat across Marlowe in his private jet as the man shared plans of their incursion. The prison where all the prisoners were being held was in India. It was far away from any settlements and hidden through the use of formations. Larry did not know what Marlowe did to get his hands on this information, but the man had a general layout of the kind of defense they had, and it honestly scared Larry a bit. There were quite a few nascent realm guards posted, not to mention defensive formations, spirit tech and more. But if, despite knowing all that, Marlowe was confident in going, Larry decided to trust him. This was not an opportunity he would get again. Perhaps it showed a hint of desperation that he was following such a crazy plan, but he'd spent way too many years suffering because of what happened to his family. He no longer had any hope that he would miraculously discover that they were actually alive, being held somewhere waiting for him to rescue them. He was convinced they were dead. He just wanted revenge. It would also help if the constant assassination threats against him would stop. He played with small, metallic beads in his hands, unaware of the pressure he was exerting on them. Every time he would swipe his thumb over them, one of them would disappear while the other beards became larger, only to return to normal with the next swipe. Such a small detail would escape most, but not Marlowe. The man was extremely meticulous, especially now that he was constantly racked with pain all over his body. But in exchange for pain, he was stuck with a new issue. His new form of cultivation depends on him continuously overcoming difficult and dangerous trials. Only by putting his life on the line would he grow stronger. Unfortunately, there were almost no such dangers left for him to face on Earth. The one exception was the place he was about to arrive. Everyone thought that he was going to get justice for the numerous wrongs that prisoners subject Earth to. Instead, he was going because there was no one left on this planet for him to pick a fight with. A wide, maniacal grin painted his face. Chapter 539 Resonance. The moment Lex set his first step onto the second floor, a couple of things happened. First, some esoteric knowledge about how using appropriate forms while punching produced different results appeared in his head. Second, his intuition started blaring about incoming danger. But by now Lex had become fairly used to emergencies. His reaction was quick yet smooth, and lacked the jerkiness that came with dodging an unexpected attack. He leaned forward just enough to dodge a paper-thin blade that had aimed to slice through the back of his neck. The fact that Lex felt the need to dodge meant that the blade was sharp enough to cut through his defenses. Calmly, he moved his hand forward and transitioned from leaning forward into a single-armed handstand, allowing him to look back. A strange-looking creature had attacked him, and was preparing to attack again after its ambush failed. It was bipedal, but with 4 arms, 2 coming out from its shoulders, but 2 coming out from its back. The arms attached to its shoulders were longer and had 8 fingers, each with a long and sharp nail that ended at an impossibly small point. The arms coming out of the back, while shorter, had 4 fingers and a thumb, and each held a weapon. One held the sword with which Lex had been attacked, while the other looked like some kind of gun. The creature also had a long and thick tail dragging behind, in the shape of a lizard's tail. While the tail did not look too flexible, the sheer size of it told of the immense strength it probably had. Not that it mattered. Lex had been wanting to try something for a while now, and this was the perfect opportunity. Using his left eye, he used evisceration. His left eye was special, he already knew that. Evisceration was an incredibly strong soul-based attack, he also knew that. What he didn't know is if the result would be greater than expected if he combined the two. The result, he didn't know how to gauge the result. Despite his promotion, the difficulty of using evisceration had not reduced. In fact, the reason he avoided using it frequently was because he feared hurting himself in the process. Even now, despite his growth, he wasn't completely confident in his perfect implementation of it. Yet he did not know if he was just better than he assumed, or it was the result of using his left eye, but he did not get hurt. Other than that, nothing much seemed to change. The strange creature directly died as a result of his attack and fell forward. Perhaps he would need to find a creature capable of surviving his attack to determine if there was a difference. That might be more difficult than it seemed, for soul attacks were always extremely lethal. Lex allowed his body to fall backwards, but quickly yet elegantly moved his feet, making it seem as if he had completed a cartwheel. It just so happened, his move had allowed him to dodge a projectile. Though he didn't want to admit it, the quick and easy defeat of his own clone had given him certain insight into his own weakness. Though the projectile was weaker than the blade and would not have broken through Lex's defense, there was no real reason to allow contact. Who said he should blindly rely on his defense just because it was strong? Instead, the protective measures he took needed to encapsulate multiple different strategies. His sharp intuition and perfect control of his body allowed him to dodge most attacks, suddenly creating a new layer of difficulty his attackers needed to overcome. This might seem like it was no different from what he did earlier, since he was always dodging attacks in his previous fights as well, but there was a fundamental difference. Earlier he dodged because all his opponents were usually stronger than him, and capable of harming him to some degree. But in the instances where he could get away with it, he took full advantage of his defense. It was the difference between strategically allowing an attack to land on his body, and allowing an attack to land because he was too lazy to dodge a weak attack. He created a small challenge for himself in addition to anything the pagoda might throw at him. He decided to see how many floors he could overcome without allowing a single rip in his clothes. After all, unlike him, they had no substantial defense at all. Lex walked forward, only glancing at his enemy long enough to kill him with a shot of evisceration. The speed at which he walked seemed completely ordinary, yet each and every move he performed allowed him to dodge an enemy attack which had started increasing. He seemed completely at ease as countless blades fell in his path and endless bullets chased him. Of course, he did not walk in a straight line, as that would be too predictable. Instead, it seemed like he was slowly warming up for a dance. There was a rhythm that his body adopted that seemed to resonate with some unseen force. He moved his head to dodge a close shave, yet if someone saw him from a distance, it would seem he was bobbing his head to a song. All the while, the number of enemies around him kept increasing, as well as bodies. He started picking up speed, but the elegance of his moves did not diminish in the slightest, and soon it was like he was on a stage giving a performance. For some reason, an image flashed in his mind of a ballet performance he saw long ago during the Midnight Games. But the image disappeared just as quickly as it came, and Lex did not really think about why he suddenly recalled it. Instead, as he made his way through this trial, and his gaze that heralded death washed over his enemies, Lex realized something else. Although the resonance was not reaching a point significant enough to produce a result yet, whatever unseen force his body was connecting to reminded him of the effect of array characters. Chapter 540 Destinies Chosen. Even as Lex was experiencing something new, he retained perfect control of his thoughts. He did not allow himself to become too excited, and calmly analyzed the situation. Although it may not have seemed like it, Lex's progress with arrays was phenomenal. Not only was he memorizing more and more arrays that could be used in various circumstances, he was further familiarizing himself with the new and unique way he designed to form arrays. He had not had too much of an opportunity to show off what he learned, but just the fact that he could defeat nascent realm cultivators before his rise in cultivation realm should have been an indication of just how much more he could do with arrays. Although arrays themselves technically had nothing to do with cultivation realm, as the strength of an array came solely from the characters used and the array itself, there was more to it than that. A greater cultivation realm allowed him more energy to power an inherently larger array than he could have before, not to mention how the boost in his mental faculties allowed him to hold on to larger arrays in his mind as well. The speed at which he could create arrays to match his circumstances also gained a massive boost. An easy way to understand it was an oversimplified comparison. Regardless of the physical strength of a person, the amount of damage a bullet could do would stay the same. The fact that Lex had grown stronger did not change how much damage the bullet could do. The fact that Lex could now aim much faster, shoot with much more accuracy, and probably wield 100 guns at the same time with the same precision due to his spirit sense also did not inherently change the destructive capabilities of the bullet. It just enhanced Lex's own capacity to cause much more damage. But even setting all that oversimplification aside, the matter at hand was that Lex was not using any arrays. So why then did he feel like he was experiencing something similar? The power of an array came not from the user, but from the universe at large. Was he in some way resonating with the universe the way array characters did? Was that the effect of new, unknown affinity? Before he could come to an answer, all the enemies were dead. This was interesting. Lex walked forward until he encountered another staircase and proceeded to climb to the next floor. His mind conjured up countless possibilities for what the actual answer was. The ring given to him by John that actually carried a compiled manual for arrays was something he consulted often, either to further his studies or provide him with answers. A part of his mind began to peruse the ring, searching for what exactly about the characters caused their relevant effects. He also wondered if the reason why the resonance he experienced didn't produce a result was because it was too weak, or because it was lacking in something else. The moment he stepped onto the third floor, despite all the calmness and coolness he displayed earlier, he stumbled. The new information that entered his mind was a guide on how to use soul energy to enhance the effects of dances. As ridiculous as that sounded, at least now he could determine what kind of rewards each floor would give him. He would receive information about how to enhance one of the techniques or abilities displayed in overcoming the previous floor. The first floor pitted him against a single enemy. The second floor put him against an entire host of enemies with a weapon strong enough to hurt him, though they were still too weak. Regardless of the fact that they were both easy to overcome for Lex, there was an exponential increase in difficulty between the floors. This theory was only reinforced once he stepped onto the third floor. This time, a massive robot stood in front of him, staring at him with red glowing eyes. It had the shape of a spider, with wings and what looked like laser turrets. Lex had a suspicion, so he tried it out and, yes, evisceration did not work on the robot because it had no soul. Even his left eye could do nothing about that. Lex shrugged. He was still not intimidated. Although he had no other good attacking techniques, as a user of Regal Embrace, it was long destined it would be so. The cultivation technique actively made it difficult for him to learn offensive techniques. Only arrays remained unaffected by the influence of his technique, so that's what he'd use. One moment they both stood still, but the next a fierce battle erupted. As ever, his signature 6 swords hovered in the air, behind Alexander. But for once they did not move to attack the horde of insectoids that attacked him, and retained their place in the sky. Instead, this time Alexander took to solving things up close and personal. Like a barbarian, he hurled himself into the endless wave of enemies, but their numbers did nothing to slow him. His exosuit suffered no harm no matter how much damage it soaked up and continued to strengthen his each and every action. It did not matter what kind of enemy came in front of him. Whether they had hard shells or indestructible carapace mattered little, for what guided his Herculean strength were a carefully selected and perfectly implemented selection of techniques. One of Alexander's greatest strengths was always his masterful use of various techniques, but that had gone to a whole new level now. He changed techniques faster than anyone could understand, moving from one to another with ease and efficiency that was almost machine-like. His whole life, he'd had many advantages that others lacked. He'd been helped and guided by the best. He'd had opportunities that most could not even imagine. But none of that made him feel like he was borrowing the strength of others, or that he hadn't earned his strength. Though he had been trained by many, he was the one who took what others gave and turned into something so much greater. He didn't need destiny to choose him or pity his weakness. He would carve out his path himself.